Lou Ferrante, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me back, Patrick. It's a pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure is mine, sir. I had you on about a year ago, and we talked about your first book in the Borgata series, Rise of an Empire: History of the American Mafia, part of the Borgata trilogy. And I absolutely love that book. And of course, any chance to have you back on for your second book in the Borgata, series, I had to jump at that. That was probably one of my most downloaded episodes. People really liked you. They liked the interview. So hopefully lightning will strike again. And yeah, just thanks for being back.
Thank you, Patrick. Absolute pleasure. And a few hosts read the books, and I know that you do, which is so awesome because you're ready. You come ready to talk about the best stuff in it. So I'm really thrilled to be here.
Well, there's a lot of good stuff in there, Lou. So let's dig in. So the first question, though, I have to ask you is: do you ever feel like your life is in danger because of writing these books? I mean, you are exposing a lot of dirt, some known, some unknown, on some very powerful families, both mob and non-mob, and politicians.
Um, yes and no. It could cross your mind, but by now, I mean, I've lived. I was on the street for years. I was in the worst penitentiaries, maximum security penitentiaries for years. Um, so I've been around death, so it doesn't really shake me.
Okay.
Yeah, and also too, I mean, it's history. You're pointing stuff out. Once it's written already, it's out there. So there really wouldn't be any benefit. I guess killing me now, it's too late. Maybe while I was writing it, they probably should have snuck in and clipped me then, but now it's done. So hopefully I'm all right.
Yeah, this latest book was all your books are eye openers, and this second book was an eye opener. I mean, it's like I knew some of the things, but I didn't know, yeah, all the stuff that was in there was very, very interesting. And of course, politics is a dirty game. It's probably as dirty or dirtier than organized crime. I think no matter
Definitely.
which side of the aisle you're on, it can be really dirty stuff. So yeah, I hope nothing happens to you, Lou. And if Hillary Clinton's like around your house, I
Yeah.
would arm yourself, buddy.
Yeah. I think it was either Patton or Eisenhower or maybe even Field Marshal Montgomery of the Brits. But one of the generals of World War II said, um, "War politics is nothing. War is nothing, rather, compared to politics." I can't remember who said it, but it's a great quote.
Oh,
Yeah, and it's
yeah.
true. What you just
I,
said, politics is like, yeah, worse than
oh,
the mob, worse than war.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, I think so too. Well, let's
yeah,
start out with your first book in this trilogy. We'll give our listeners and watchers a little bit of backstory here. Borgata: Rise of an Empire: The History of the American Mafia, the Borgata trilogy. Can you give us a quick overview of that book? That's book one.
sure. So the first book was I really, really wanted to go deep into history and trace the origins of the mafia, how it came about in Sicily, what were the mechanisms that caused it to come about, socioeconomic, etc. And I was able to really, really dig up a lot that I felt needed to be presented in book form to a reader and has never been before. So I really get discouraged when, for example, I pick up, let's say, a book on the Roman Empire and it begins with Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar. I want to know how Rome started.
Right.
What created, yeah, what created Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar? What were the things that happened? So I did the same in Rise of Empire, and I also then followed and traced how the mafia, after it started in Sicily, came over to the United States and how they traveled here with the immigrant wave of honest, hardworking Italian Americans, but they were criminals and they picked up where they left off in Sicily in most cases. And they spread out with the immigrant waves who were looking for work across the country. They spread out to all the different metropolitan areas and then planted flags in all the major cities, the mob did. And I felt like that was also an interesting part to me. I like to see a sweeping history, how it all starts, how it spreads out. And then I went through Prohibition, how the mob moved over into Cuba and began a gambling empire there, as well as Las Vegas. So I covered the major the major events that took place in Rise of Empire. And it really was their golden age. They pretty much were getting away with everything. They learned how to bribe politicians. They learned how to work with them. The American system is a free system, a democratic system, a capitalist system, but rife with opportunities for mobsters to manipulate it to their advantage because it's so free. So, for example, if you tried to start a mafia in Stalin's Russia or Russia, I mean, they'd stamp you right out in 3 seconds. You're not going to
Right.
get away with it. They're going to throw you in a gulag and it's over. We have individual rights, and we used to have them more than we do today, which is a conversation for another day. But I felt like they eroded over the last few years. I saw things happen that I never thought would happen. I saw the RICO laws used in ways I never imagined they would be used. Um, and I knew that would come one day because I had studied the RICO law. I
Mm.
learned law while I was in prison myself. I reversed one of my cases with the Second Circuit Court of Appeals while I was in prison. I helped other people with their cases. So I knew that there was going to be problems one day, and I still think there will be more as we move forward in this country. But Rise of Empire was the golden age of the mob, and it moves into Clash of Titans, which is the first real problems that they're going to encounter.
Yeah, with the rise of empire, I love the history behind all of it. Probably because I'm the product of immigrants. Anybody that comes over to this country comes to this country from somewhere else, looking for a better life, et cetera, et cetera. So, I found it very interesting what Italian Americans went through and how poorly they were treated,
Mhm,
and how they had to scrape and just crawl their way up the ladder more or less.
mhm,
So that was very interesting. And also what I found very interesting was the role that Joe Kennedy played
mhm,
with the mafia.
mhm,
And you touched on it a bit in the
mhm,
first book, and then you really dive
mhm,
in the
mhm,
second, and I was like, oh, and
mhm,
we will talk about that later,
mhm,
because
mhm,
that was very interesting to me. I was just
mhm.
like, wow.
Yeah, just
I
no, I was saying before we jump to it later, I wanted you pointed out something interesting. Your family are Irish immigrants. The Irish went through the identical experience as the Italians when they first got to this country, and it almost seems like how like everybody beats up on the freshmen, then the
Yeah.
freshmen become sophomores and juniors, and then they do
Right.
it next. It's the same thing with each immigrant wave that came to America. The Irish were despised, they were spit on, they were considered the lowest of the low until they made their own way in America and showed everyone that they were brilliant people, they were industrious, they were hardworking, and then they became part of the American tapestry. The same thing then happened following the Irish immigrant wave with the Italian immigrant wave, and
Right.
so on. So it's a really, really interesting thing that you pointed that out. And Joe Kennedy, who was Irish American, had a chip on his shoulder because he felt as an Irishman, he was never really permitted in the WASP clubs,
Right.
the yacht
Yeah.
club, the marine. Yeah, he always had a chip on his shoulder and he looked for any advantage he could get because he always felt like he was ostracized, in polite society. He just felt like no matter how much money he made, he wasn't accepted as an Irishman. And
Yeah.
I just wanted to point that out before we move to it later because it's really interesting the Irish American experience, which I wish I could have written about more, is identical to the Italian American experience. In some cases, worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Now for the second book, the newest in the Borgata trilogy, Borgata Clash of Titans: A History of the American Mafia, Volume 2. You
Mhm,
know, that's I really really enjoyed reading that book. Way to go. You write great books, my friend. So let's dig into that. But first I want to talk just a little bit, and this is related to the second book, Trump signing off on the Warren Commission files. What do you
mhm.
think?
I am so thrilled that he is doing this. I believe he's the only president in history that would have had the guts to do it. I believe he wanted to do it his first term, and was received a real persuasive argument not to do it from Mike Pompeo and others. And I wish that he would have overruled
Yeah.
and ruled against that argument, but he didn't. But now he has a second chance, and he's exposing it. And I'm not sure. So I'll give you there's various thoughts I have on it.
Okay.
As thrilled as I am that we'll be getting the documents, I'm skeptical as to what we'll see, and there's several reasons for that. One is um, a lot of stuff is in the National Archives, and then there are other files that the FBI and the CIA held that were never presented to the Warren Commission.
Yeah, right.
So the Warren, yeah, so it was very, very. Um, they cherry picked what they would give the commission.
Mhm.
Hoover did, and as well as the CIA. The CIA almost gave them close to nothing. The CIA handed over to the Warren Commission almost nothing, and the FBI they had a different tact. They Hoover wanted to basically only give them evidence that directed them to rule the way he felt the ruling should be. So Oswald is the lone gunman and the lone nut, did it by himself. Ruby was a lone nut who came along and killed Oswald, did that by himself. No conspiracy, domestic or international, nothing to see here. And he
Yeah.
made sure that he only gave them evidence that suggested that. And he also flooded them with a whole an overabundance of useless information. So, for example, all the cranks that would contact the FBI with ridiculous leads, Hoover decided it was good to give the commission that so that they would be confused as to what the hell's going on. So he flooded them with useless information, held back pertinent information, and handpicked what he would give them. So I'm skeptical as to what we'll see. The next thing is over the course of 6 decades since John Fitzgerald Kennedy was killed, they've had a lot of time to destroy the
Yeah,
most important files.
that's true.
Yeah, and how hard is it to sneak into a building that they own in the
Yeah,
middle of the night when they
right.
have the keys,
Yeah,
with a paper shredder? I mean,
right.
it's not like it's not even the Watergate robbery where people are actually breaking into a building. It's their building, they own it.
Right. Yeah, they have
So
the security codes. Yeah, they have all of it. Yeah.
exactly. So I don't know what we're going to get. The last thing I would say, and uh, I'm once again hugely excited that President Trump is doing this. I think it's a rare thing. No American president has wanted to do it before. That said, I wish he was not allowing. I think it's Representative Luna in South Florida or either Orlando or South Florida. I forget which district she's from, but she's reading it before she gives it to us. I just don't want it read. Give it to us.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, just dump it on our doorstep. Let us sift through it. We've waited long enough. I know that I understand there may be redactions. Somebody may be alive, but she's a politician and she's not Trump. Trump's a rare breed where
That
he's
he
willing
is.
to.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he's willing to go. He'll lock horns with the establishment, and he's proved it time and time again. He's not afraid. He never backs down. But can we say the same for this congresswoman? I don't know. I don't know if let's say, for example, the Cuban exiles had a role in the conspiracy, and maybe there are uh, their ancestors of some of her biggest donors in Florida. Is she willing to
Right. Yeah.
hand that over to us, or she's going to try to maybe hold that back and not offend one of her donors who says, "Why did you expose my grandfather as being a member of the plot?" Now you're not going to be getting any money from me, moving forward. Nobody's Trump. Nobody has the in plain English, the balls that Trump has. So I just wish he wasn't giving it to another politician to review before we get it. That's another problem I have with it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And before I read this book, I had an inclination that okay, the Warren Commission files, it's like, oh, cool, finally we're able to see it, but they are not perfect. Who knows how they've been doctored or whatever through, like you said, through how many
Yeah.
years, please.
Yeah. Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's something you have to take with a grain of salt. And
Mhm.
you know, I don't want to get too political, but now you've got a sitting president who doesn't care whose feathers he ruffles,
Mhm.
and he doesn't have to care about getting reelected. So
No.
it's like he's completely unmuted now.
Yeah.
There's no muffler on this guy.
Yeah.
He's just gonna
Yeah.
go full steam ahead. So
Yeah. I
it
mean,
may,
I believe if President Trump was the one who was going to sift through them, we'd get 100% of them. I
yeah,
just don't believe. Once you leave Trump, there's only a few people around him that I feel are of the same mold.
mm,
And he's put quite a few of them powerful positions already. But I just, and the run-of-the-mill politicians, I have a distrust for. So
So
I'm
do I.
hoping we see everything. Yeah, I hope we see everything in both parties.
Yes.
Just even in Trump's own party, I just don't trust all of them.
Nope.
Um, yeah, some of them swear allegiance to him, but would abandon ship at the slightest sight of an iceberg. Yeah.
You
So
got that
yeah,
right.
I just
So,
feel that. Yeah.
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 So, knowing all the stuff that you know, if you're going to
Mhm.
make a guess, who do you think killed Kennedy?
I feel I did over 10 years of research for the whole trilogy and writing the
Okay.
book. I misspoke on another interview where I said 10 years of research on the Kennedy stuff. Basically, it was 10 years of research with regard to the trilogy, and a huge part of that, because there's a lot of things I covered: the Bananos, the Colombo mob, the LA mob, Havana, Cuba, the Jews, the Italians. I covered so many different things that, but Kennedy sucked up a lot of that research. And after
Sure.
all of the research I did, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it was a mob slash rogue CIA slash Cuban exile cabal. So the main players for the mob would be Carlos Marcello of Louisiana, the Don of Louisiana,
Hmm.
who despised Robert F. Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy's attorney general. And the reason why the mob, just to back up a little, because it's really interesting, the reason why most of the mob backed the Kennedys and someone like Marcello didn't is because Bobby had before Jack was elected president, Bobby had he was chief counsel to the McClellan Committee, also known as the Rackets Committee. And during the McClellan Committee, Bobby went after the mob and subpoenaed them all before him, and he browbeat them, and he really, really desperately tried to humiliate them in public. His televised hearings, and he humiliated them in front of the national audience. And he also went after the Teamsters, which were, to Bobby's credit, they were heavily infested with mobsters. Not that Dave Beck, who was the president of the Teamsters before Jimmy Hoffa took over, not to their discredit, but because they had no choice but to compromise with the mob. The mob controlled all of the locals in all of the various cities across the country.
Sure.
So, for example, you couldn't become Teamster president if you didn't make sure that Chicago and New York were in favor of you becoming president. And the Chicago mob controlled the locals in Chicago and a lot of the Midwestern locals. The Detroit mob controlled the Detroit locals. The New York mob controlled the New York locals. And unless they were in favor of you, you weren't going to become Teamster president. So they kind of had their hands tied. And it was always a balancing act, to do what's best for the working man who drove trucks every day for the Teamsters and to make the mob happy. Hoffa was a tough guy, I got to tell you. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that time and again, he knew how to tell the mob no. And the mob did not like that.
Sure.
And we could talk about that later, which went into them eventually replacing him with Fitzsimmons. But Hoffa knew how to say no. If it wasn't a good deal for the Teamsters, he said no. But that said, he gave hundreds of millions of dollars to the mob, but all of the investments were good deals. Who could argue that Hoffa dumping money into Las Vegas wasn't a good investment? I wish I put a
Right.
few bucks into Las Vegas.
Yeah, you would be both. Oh my
Right?
gosh.
I mean,
If
come on, right?
if I had a time machine, oh yeah, there's no doubt about
Exactly.
that.
Exactly. We'd be on our own island right now doing this. So, so Hoffa was smart where if the mob came to him and said, look, we're throwing up 4 hotel casinos in Las Vegas. We need 30 million. Here it is. He wrote the check. But if they came to him and said, look, we want to build a swamp in the Midwest where
Right.
there's nothing there and we just want the money, it's a scam, he'd say, hell no. You're not going to
Yeah.
milk my pension fund for that. So he really always looked out for the Teamsters, Hoffa did. But to get back to Bobby went after the mob in the McClellan Committee, known as the Rackets Committee. Afterwards, Jack announces his candidacy for the Democratic nomination for president, and Bobby quits the committee and becomes his campaign manager. Now, the mob, you would think, wouldn't want the Kennedys anywhere near the Oval Office. I mean, obviously, Bobby just got done going after them, and Jack was
Right.
part of the committee too. He convinced Jack to sit on it as well as a senator. So Bobby is hated by the mob So why did they sign on? Well, two reasons. One is Joe Kennedy, and the other one is Frank Sinatra. Joe Kennedy Sr. had a long-standing relationship with the mob. And I don't quote mobsters who say that, although a lot of testimony comes from mobsters who say, hey, we worked with Joe Kennedy during Prohibition and
Sure.
after Prohibition. Yeah, plenty of mobsters. Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Oni the Killer Madden, who was an English, of Irish descent, English-born mobster who grew up in New York. And you have to imagine how many people you have to kill for if you hang around with killers and they name you the killer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah. So Oni the Killer Madden, who also said, hey, Joe Kennedy worked with us. Oni the Killer Madden owned the Cotton Club and other clubs. He was partners with Arnold Rothstein and Lucky Luciano. And he said, look, we got our liquor supplies at times from Joe Kennedy. He had the best stuff. But I also quoted members of the Kennedy clan, the Kennedy family, people who were appointed judges by the Kennedys, who said Joe was deeply entrenched with the mob. He couldn't have operated during Prohibition and after with his alcohol. Joe Kennedy owned a liquor company without the mob's backing, without their okay. He also had Hollywood production companies that he could have never. He would have had labor problems if he didn't make deals with the mob. So, and he also was part owners of the Cal Neva Lodge, a resort / casino that sat on the border of California and Nevada. The reason it was called the Cal Neva Lodge, where pretty much the Nevada side had all of the gambling machines because it was legal in Nevada. So Joe Kennedy was partners there with Frank Sinatra and Sam Giancana of the Chicago mob and a few other people. So Joe Kennedy says, look, if my kids get in, I promise you, they're not going to be bothered with you guys. They're going to move on to other issues that the United States is facing. For example, civil rights for African Americans, slowing down the nuclear arms race with the Soviets. There are big issues. We're not going to be chasing a bunch of Italians around town. Don't worry about it. Frank Sinatra, who was a liaison between the Kennedy family, who he was very close with, and the mob, who he was also close with, also persuaded them, hey, look, the Kennedys aren't going to bother with you. Get them in office, help them out, and they won't bother with you guys. And they believed Frank Sinatra because Frank Sinatra made the argument, hey, look, Governor Dewey, first he was a prosecutor, Thomas Dewey. He went after the mob, but once he made a name for himself, he moved on, went for governor, then ran for the Republican nomination for president against Truman and FDR. Also, too, Senator S.T. Schifalva from Tennessee, he went after the mob in the beginning, and then he made a name for himself, and then he ran for the Democratic nomination for president. So they move on typically. So they believe the Kennedys would. So what happened was the Chicago mob and the New York mob said, fine, we'll back Kennedy. They dumped a lot of money into the West Virginia primary, where Kennedy squeaked it out against Hubert Humphrey. And they also locked down Illinois during the general election against Richard Nixon. And there was a lot of voter fraud.
Yeah, a lot of dead people voted in that election.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly
they
right.
rose from the dead. They did their best Jesus impersonation and went to the polls.
Exactly. So that, you know, the mob pulled it out for them there, and they pulled it out for them in West Virginia during the primary. They pulled it out for them in Texas. So they had a lot of pull in different places. They made sure the Kennedys won. And then after they did that, Joe Kennedy tells Jack, you're putting Bobby in as attorney general. And Bobby supposedly didn't even want it. He's like, I wasn't expecting this. And what the Kennedy family themselves, sisters, said, Dad wanted Bobby in to make sure no one was going to poke around and try to figure out how the election was won.
Okay.
You know, you have millions of dollars in mob money. Some of it's being diverted from Las Vegas with the Chicago mob. Some of it's being dumped from other places directly from Chicago or New York. And a lot of the investigations in I quoted newspapers where there were journalist teams investigating voter fraud. And those investigations will literally shut down the minute Bobby became AG, because where were they going to go? If Bobby's making the decisions of who gets prosecuted and who doesn't, even J. Edgar Hoover said, all of the accusations that were passing my desk, there was no need to present them to the attorney general because you just throw them in the garbage. You know, he said it in his own words. That's not a direct quote, but he said so much.
But isn't that ironic that the old man, Joe, who's pulling all the strings, that has this grand plan, goes to is deeply embedded with the mob. The mob gets his kids, what he wanted them to do, president, attorney general, then, running for president, etc. And it led to their ultimate demise.
Yeah, it did, and that is the irony. I guess it's as
Yeah,
Shakespeare said, "Falling by one's own petard." It led to their ultimate demise. And what happened was, though, there was a couple of holdouts. So this is an interesting piece of the puzzle. When 99% of the mob decides to believe Joe Kennedy Sr. and Frank Sinatra and goes with the Kennedy boys and says, "Fine, we'll get Jack in the Oval Office." Um, there were a couple of holdouts, one being Carlos Marcello of Louisiana, and another one being Santo Trafficante of Florida, and the last one being, who wasn't really a mobster, but in bed with the mob, Jimmy Hoffa, the head of the Teamsters. Those three figures said, "There's no way in hell we believe this. We're not backing the Kennedys." So
that's
the
right.
first thing those guys did was back Lyndon Johnson during the primary. And then when Johnson lost to Kennedy and was handpicked as his VP, then they switched over and backed Nixon during the general election.
Mm.
So Bobby, once he becomes attorney general, had an sort of like, although he hated the whole mob, he had an extra sense of hatred for Marcello Trafficante and Hoffa because they refused to back his brother. So he really, really handpicked them to go after them with extra force. And so once Bobby becomes AG, to the mob's surprise, he musters all of the agencies within his command. As Attorney General, the FBI is under him, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, uh, the Narcotics Bureau, everything, all of the different agencies under Bobby's command are now sort of like concentrated for an attack, a blitzkrieg against the mob. So the rest of the mob is going, "Son of a bitch, we put him in, and this is what he's doing to us." For example, Sam Giancana, who backed the Kennedys and helped them pull it out in
In
Chicago.
Chicago, yeah.
Yeah, Giancana is going, "What the hell is going on here?" So what happened was by time Bobby ramped up all the investigation, he's locking up mobsters with breakneck speed, investigating them. They said, "Let's go to Joe Kennedy." Joe Kennedy's word was law within the Kennedy clan.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, whatever he said goes, and that's it. So they said, "We'll go to Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy will rein Bobby in 2 minutes." So they're planning to go. They go to Frank Sinatra. They said, "Look, you go tell Joe that his little promises to us are being broken, and he needs to fix this right away." Well, it turns out that it's less than a year into Jack's term, and Joe Kennedy plays a round of golf, I think in Palm Beach, and afterwards he gets a little dizzy, goes home, lays down, has a massive stroke,
Yeah.
and he's basically an invalid. And at that point, as Gore Vidal, who was a member of the Kennedy clan through marriage, he famously said, had Joe not had that stroke, he could have straightened out the problem with the mob in 2 minutes. And because Joe would have said to Bobby, "Look, this is done. You're not going to go after communists like Hoover wants to, and
Right.
forget about this whole mob thing. Go after other people." But Joe's incapacitated. Bobby then gets approached by Sinatra, who has no choice but to approach him directly. And Bobby is incensed by Sinatra's invasive, um, butting his nose into Attorney
Yeah.
General's business. And Bobby gives Sinatra a piece of his mind, then goes to Jack and says, "You can no longer be friends with Sinatra. Cross him off any guest list to the White House.
Wow.
You're not going to his house anymore. He's connected with mobsters across the country." And Jack, pretty much, who's an easygoing guy, nods along, and he's fine with it. So I got to tell you, I walked away from all my research with, you can't help but dislike Bobby after you learn all the things he does, and you can't help but like Jack. Jack, as people, I mean, as a person, Jack was a friend maker. He was like how to make friends and influence people his whole life. He really, really went out of his way to not burn bridges, to always make friends. Whereas Bobby, Joe Kennedy famously said, "Bobby hates like me, and he carries grudges like me." And
Mm.
on another occasion, Joe Kennedy said, "Bobby would have been a great Nazi if he lived during Hitler's time." if he was part of the Gestapo, rather, he said he would have been, because he was alive, obviously, during Hitler's time, but he was an American. But he said if he was in Germany, he would have been a great Nazi because he was such a didn't matter. This is what I'm going after you. I only see black and white. I don't see any gray area. Whereas Jack was easygoing. But I think Bobby was sort of at that point doing what he wanted, and Jack was just Jack was running around with different affairs, having a good time.
Oh yeah, he wasn't a good husband, that's for sure.
No, he was a philanderer. Jack was a big
Yeah.
philanderer. Nowadays, today, he would be Me Too'd morning, noon, and night.
Oh
But
yeah.
but back then, look, that's what men did, and it was kind of like, every president had girlfriends, and the American public really didn't care back then.
Right.
But he was easygoing.
Yeah, interesting. Being, brought up Catholic, good Irish Catholic boy, etc. I was interested in the Catholic religion in the mob. Could you touch on that a little bit?
Sure. So, most mobsters, if not all, are Catholics because they come from Italy.
Right.
The seat of the seat of Rome, the seat of the Roman Catholic Church. So most mobsters are Catholic, and they felt that they had that in common with the Kennedys because the Kennedys were staunch Catholics.
Right.
I mean, very, very orthodox to an extent, especially Bobby. Jack, you could argue wasn't, but Bobby believed he was, even though Bobby cheated a lot too. Bobby fooled around with Marilyn Monroe. He played around as well, and Bobby did a lot of things that a good Catholic wouldn't consider religious. But Bobby did feel that he was a good Catholic. Both Kennedys were married by cardinals. One was married by Cardinal Cushing, and the other one was married by, gosh, it escapes me at the moment, but another one was married by another famous cardinal. So the mob felt like, look, we're all Catholics too. We've been beat up in this country. It's mostly a Protestant country at that time. It was thought of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. For the most part, all the people in power were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So the Catholics were always at a disadvantage in this country. Nobody even believed Jack could be a Catholic president, especially Hubert Humphrey tried to use that against Jack Kennedy in West Virginia. And that's where the mob helped the Kennedys most, in West Virginia. And Jack pulled it out. They tried to say, look, you know what? He's a Catholic, and we don't want a Catholic in there. We'll have the Pope in the White House.
Yeah, the Pope in the White House. Yeah, I've
Yeah,
heard that a bunch of
right.
times. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it was something that they felt they had in common with the Kennedys. But Bobby, being sort of like, as Joe Kennedy said, a bit of a Gestapo, he used that against the mob. So Bobby went and he literally poured through the records, the marital records of mob families. So he would go through, for example, the entire marital records of the Gambino family, and he was shocked to learn that a lot of cousins were into marrying, and the sister-in-law was the cousin of the brother-in-law, and the brother-in-law was the father-in-law of the sister-in-law, and it was so confusing, but they were all interconnected. It was like one big family, and I covered that thoroughly in the first volume.
Yeah. Yeah, you opened my eyes. I never heard that before. I was just like, ew, that's kind of gross.
I had no idea. So when I was in jail, I was with a Sicilian gangster, and he told me that he said, my wife's coming up. And when his wife came up, she looked just like him. And he says, oh yeah, she's my cousin.
Oh.
So I meant like first or second cousin. And he goes, no, she's my second or third cousin. He goes, no, she's my cousin. So I was like, what? So look, the marriage pools in Sicily throughout the ages were kind of like small.
Yeah.
So a lot of times they married each other and then they kept it in the family where, look, we have a lot of money and power. Let's keep it in the family. A lot of rich families do that nowadays to this day, wealthy families. So, and throughout history, they have a lot of German families have done that. So the mob did it, and Bobby was incensed by it. He went to the Catholic Church, the Archdiocese, and he pointed it out to them that you guys are sanctioning incestuous marriages, and you have to stop this. Well, there were friends of the Kennedy family that said it's a little bit hypocritical. Not only were the Kennedys hypocritical by going after the mob because their own money was dirty through Joe Kennedy, the Kennedy fortune could arguably be considered dirty because Joe Kennedy worked with the mob. So not only was that hypocritical, but it was also hypocritical to point out these marriages to the archdiocese when everybody around the Kennedy family knew that the Kennedy boys traded girlfriends with each other, and they also traded the same girlfriends with the father.
Oh, it's
And
so
and
gross.
and
Oh,
I yeah, and I literally point that out. Now, none of this,
yeah.
by the way, just so you know, I don't make uh careless accusations. I don't ever just throw something out there without sourcing it. So if you read the books, all of my books are heavily sourced. I quote people in the back exactly where the quote came from. And that came directly from people around the Kennedy family who liked the Kennedys. They weren't necessarily their adversaries. They were
Yeah.
friends and family of the Kennedys who said this is basically what happened within the family. So I always make sure that I source something. I don't
Sure.
like to be, I never want to be a historian who just throws something out there and says, this is what I think or this is what I feel.
Mm,
I could do that with you on a podcast. We could discuss
right.
things, toss it around and give our opinions. And, it's different. But when you put it in paper and you don't have an opportunity to explain it to a reader, I have to source it. It
Yeah,
has to
but
be.
yeah, if it's coming from you, it's an educated guess. If
Yeah.
that's the way I look at it. For sure. So, again, coming from Chicago, obviously I knew organized crime was a thing in Chicago. Could you kind of touch on, the history of organized crime in Chicago and
Sure.
politics?
Sure. So what happened was in Chicago, they had a sort of the same technique. They took over the political machine in Chicago with the same technique that Frank Costello had once used to take over Tammany Hall in New York, the Democratic machine that controlled New York. Frank Costello would try to control the different precincts and wards so that once he had enough of them, he would then put the leader in Tammany Hall. If you control the different wards, then you control who's going to be the leader. Once you control the leader, you can control who becomes mayor, who becomes governor. And the Chicago mob had the same approach. So basically, they controlled certain wards that were heavily influenced by Italian voting machines or by Italian voters. And they basically controlled the ballot boxes, the machines, the politicians.
Mm,
And they also had the power because they controlled the major wards that they would then put the mayor in place. Mayor Daley, someone recently pushed back and said, "Oh, Mayor Daley was clean." Mayor Daley wasn't clean. Mayor Daley, there's mob eavesdropping devices where the mob says we put him in, and he's been good to us. We put him in, and we've been good to him. He's been good to us. So this is all. I mean, Hoover had this information back then, and Mayor Daley was also very close with the Kennedys. And there are books that I've sourced that say that Daley had, mafia influence. Now, did he limit that influence? Maybe more than others did. Yes, probably. Some of them were completely, hook, line, and sinker in the mob's pocket. But the mob also had control in, for example, I came across eavesdropping devices, recording transcripts where the mob said, "We don't like this police commissioner. He's been hard to us. Let's get rid of him." And then they reach out to the mayor, and the mayor gets rid of the police commissioner. And they put one who's more malleable in. So that would happen. So the mob really, really had a lot of control over the different wards and then had control over the major city of Chicago, and then in turn had control over, just like the lower boroughs of New York and Manhattan could swing the whole state. At one time, you could look at upstate New York and the entire region would be red. And then this little tiny spot in the bottom would be blue. And the state would always vote blue
yeah.
because they have this population down there.
Mm,
And, so the same thing, if the mob could control Chicago, they had a good deal of Illinois wrapped up. And they could basically sway an election. So Sam Giancana was the acting boss for the Chicago mob at the time. The guy in the shadows was Anthony Joe Bad Zaccardo. He was the real mob boss who kind of like took a step back, put Sam Giancana in as a front man. Him with the help of he had a close circle around him, Joey Dove Zayupa and a couple of other guys. And they liked Giancana in the beginning. They thought Giancana would make a good acting boss. Giancana helped swing the election toward the Kennedys. Later on, they had a problem with Giancana. He was too showy, hung out with Sinatra too much. He caused too
mm.
much. And then he would be questioned later on, and they decided it was time to kill him. But that's much later.
Yeah.
But at this point,
Yeah,
yeah,
because, growing up, Mayor Daley, there's two Mayor Daleys, the old man, then his kid later on. and they called it the Daily Machine.
Yeah.
It was the machine. I
Yeah.
remember asking my parents about it, and like my my grandma and grandpa had a house at 45th in California on the south side,
Mhm.
and there was somebody knocking on the door for Mayor Daley, and it's like, hey, I hope you're gonna vote for Mayor Daley, aren't you? And so
Mhm.
my grandma, being the pistol that she was, she's just like, well, what do I get out of it? And
That's
the
great.
guy is like, well, what would you like?
Yeah.
And she said, I need some new cabinets in my kitchen. If you give me new cabinets, I'll put that yard sign, I'll put the signs in my window, and I'll put a yard sign in my front lawn. And he's like, done. The next
That's
day, here
great.
come these guys, rip out the old cabinets, put new cabinets up. Grandma was a Mayor Daley lover for life. Oh my
That is
God.
great. That is great.
Yeah, but that's how things were done back then.
Yeah.
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 I
That's
just,
right. Yeah.
I love that story.
That's how those political machines worked. I mean, they really, really, literally, it was more hands-on. Tammany Hall was the same way. I mean, they bought immigrants coats, they gave them food.
Oh, yeah.
Um, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
the old man, Daley, would go into taverns with frozen turkeys.
There you go.
Yeah, he would just start handing out turkeys to people, and they needed them. They were hungry.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
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 you gotta love it. That I love those
yeah.
old stories. I
Yeah,
mean,
it was a different day and age. I mean,
yeah.
now they could never do that to politicians.
Oh no,
Yeah,
well, there's no social media. Social media was pounding the pavement and
yeah,
actually talking to people, and all that kind of
yeah,
stuff. So it was
yeah,
interesting. So Joe
yeah,
Kennedy, let's talk a little more about him. He's the big boss, no doubt about it.
yeah.
His alliance with the mob, bootlegging. Then there
Mhm.
was like killing illegal aliens, like dumping them off boats. What was
Yeah,
that?
well, I had one source for that, and
Yeah.
it was the Bonanos, Joe Bonanno, the father, and Bill Bonanno, the son, Salvatore Bill Bonanno. And they basically said that they always hated the Kennedys because there was a story where Kennedy had a shipment of alcohol coming in at one point during Prohibition. And there were also illegal aliens on the boat. And according to the Bonanos, um, the when the chases came after them at sea, the Coast Guard chases, Coast Guard cutters, when they came after them at sea, they had to lighten the load, and they decided, hey, look, the immigrants could swim. We
God.
can't lose the alcohol; that'll sink. Dump the immigrants. So they dumped the immigrants overboard, kept the alcohol, and supposedly the Bananos felt that the decision was pre-made by Kennedy. Like if you're in a tight spot, I guess that's sort of not necessarily. Again, I attribute this to the Bananos. Take it or leave it. I want to make sure that the source is there, that
Right.
the reader could see it. I had no reason to disbelieve it. However, I'm bit prejudiced because I'm reading about all the other things Joe Kennedy is doing. So it kind of like fit into that.
Right.
But another reader might say, well, that's not true. Maybe he did the other stuff, but I can't imagine he did that. Whatever the case is, this came directly from the Bonanos who worked with him during Prohibition. And they said that they did not like that. The Bonanos were sort of, I guess they were more uh, I guess they cared more about the immigrant community at that point because the
Mm.
immigrant community were a lot of immigrant Italians coming in who were joining the mafia too at the same
Right.
time.
Right.
So they might
Well,
have, yeah.
Well, the Kennedys and drowning people is nothing new. Just
There you go. Oh,
look
there
at
you
Teddy,
go.
and Chappaquiddick, and
Yeah,
it's amazing how like young people have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. If you talk
right.
about Teddy Kennedy and Chappaquiddick, they're like, "What? Mary
What are
Jo
you
who?"
talking about? Yeah,
It's like, you should
yeah,
know your history. But
yeah,
anyways,
yeah.
and then the last thing, FDR and Joe Kennedy, what was the connection?
So Joe Kennedy Sr. had an idea that he backed FDR, as most of the country did. He was a very popular president, FDR. And he backs FDR with a lot of money, obviously. And he's expecting something in return. So FDR first makes him the head of the Security and Exchange Commission. And there's a quote famously. There's a conversation that I reported in the book. I source my information once again, but there's a conversation that takes place where Joe Kennedy basically said, "Look, a lot of people. I've had a long career on Wall Street, and a lot of people would say I'd be the last man you'd want to make the head of the Security and
Yeah.
Exchange Commission." And basically, he's admitting that he's, There's a lot of accusations that he played around with stocks. He did pump and dump. He had insider trading, and he made a lot of his fortune that way. And he's basically telling FDR, look, true or not, I'm going to come under fire. And FDR said, well, the hell with all of those people who might say something. The best way to catch a crook is with a crook. So you're going to be the head of it. So yeah. So at another point, he makes him the head of the Maritime Commission, which was also another bit of irony because if it's true that he dumped immigrants overboard, now he's head of the Maritime Commission.
Yeah.
So this is another interesting, right, piece of the history,
God.
right?
Yes.
Of all the things, right? So
Right.
then at some point he's appointed ambassador to Great Britain, which was the premier ambassadorial post uh, you could have. A lot
Sure.
of ambassadors to St. James Place, Great Britain, went on to become presidents. And Joe Kennedy knew that. And he had ambitions of becoming president one day. Joe
Right.
Kennedy did. So he's ambassador to Britain, takes the whole family to England. And, they had a little bit of a rough time. Don't forget, uh, as much as the British liked them for being American,
Didn't
they're
like him
still
for being
Irish.
Irish.
Yeah, they're still Irish.
Yep.
The Irish weren't they were looked down upon by the Brits and a lot of Brits, back then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they
You
had a
know,
rough.
I was in Belfast in 2019,
Mhm.
and a lot has not changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have friends that are English. My uncle lives in
Mhm.
London, blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
But I'll never forget, somebody introduced
Mhm.
me,
Mhm.
and it's like a good friend of theirs, and I'm good friends with this person. It's like,
Mhm.
oh, hey, this is Pat O'Donnell, and he's like, Catholic.
Yeah.
Just the look on his face, he just wanted
To
to
this day.
punch me. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm
To this.
just like, what did I do to you, dude?
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
whatever. But yeah, there's a whole lot of hate there, and that doesn't go away overnight. So yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
get that. So
Yeah.
yeah, he did want to become president, but he was kind of anti-democracy, more like
Uh,
pro-Hitler and Nazis.
yeah. So, yeah, it's a great point you bring up. He becomes he's pro-democracy until Hitler's running over Europe. And it looks like Hitler's just going to be like stampeding across the European continent. And Joe Kennedy's pretty sure he's going to be victorious in the end. And he did feel like the democracies were unequal to the task of removing Hitler from power or destroying the Blitzkrieg, the Nazi war machine, the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe. So um, he's sort of like Joe Kennedy's sort of a defeatist. He's like, okay, the democracies are done. Like if we get into this war, if Britain wants to get in, that's their business. But we as Americans should not back them. Democracy is done in Britain. It's all over, believing that Hitler would win
Yeah.
and rule the continent. And we should just leave them to themselves. Now, there's a few reasons why people later said that Joe made that statement. One being, if the United States backed Great Britain and got into the war, he would immediately lose at least three of his sons to the fight. So
Mm,
you have Joe Kennedy Jr., who's of age, and Jack Kennedy, who's of age, and Bobby is coming of age, Robert F. Kennedy. So if there's a war, you could technically lose three sons, and you could also lose what he feared even equal to that was his fortune. He was terrified of losing his fortune. And he felt that if we get involved and Hitler's triumphant, there goes my fortune.
oh,
Um, yeah, so a lot of people also said that. So he's terrified, and he sort of like makes these derogatory comments toward Churchill, toward the king, um, and toward American democracy. And what he does is he makes these comments. He was interviewed by two journalists in a hotel room, and as he's sitting with them, he was promised that it would be off the record. And he makes these derogatory comments against the major democracies, us in Great Britain. And one of the journalists who made him this promise was old school, and he kept up his promise to him.
mm,
He said, "I'm not going to report this. This is
yeah.
off. This is off the record. Joe Kennedy told us this, and it means something if I give you my word." The other journalist said, "This is too big of a scoop. I'm breaking my word. I don't care."
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And he ran and he printed it. Yep. So once it came out, Joe Kennedy was done. Now he's got an
Yeah.
opportunity he wanted to be president. And how are you going to be president if, the man who wants to be president of the world's leading democracy says democracy's done?
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
finished.
Yeah. Good luck with that
So,
one. But,
good luck.
wouldn't have been interesting though if Hitler, this is history again,
Mhm.
didn't have such a hard on for the Russians, for the Soviet
Right.
Union.
Yeah.
If he would have stuck to, if he didn't go into this two front war,
Mhm.
where how many millions, died,
Mhm.
what would the
Mhm.
landscape look like today?
He would have won. Joe
Yeah.
would have been right. Joe probably would have been right. I mean, Hitler raced right over France, and after he did so, Mussolini hopped in, and
Yep.
Mussolini thought, "Oh, it's a great time for me to get involved now." He was a little bit of a Johnny come lately, but he figured it's a good time. So now you have, the Axis was doing good. Hitler made a major blunder. Thank God for us in the free world that he did,
Yep.
and credit to the Russians for stopping him basically at Stalingrad. They dug in and
Right.
they wouldn't give up. They wouldn't give an inch in Stalingrad, and they held off in Moscow. The siege of Moscow, Leningrad. These are really, really important pieces of history where the Russians were just like a war machine that was equal to the Nazi war machine, and they weren't afraid of the cold. And obviously, then the German army had to retreat or
Yes.
try to retreat when it was too late. Hitler wouldn't let them retreat at first until it
Right.
was
And
too late.
they weren't equipped for that kind of cold.
No,
That was,
yeah,
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 just, and everybody was fighting in
yeah.
Russia. Yeah. It's like,
Everybody,
yeah,
women, children. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. It was,
yeah,
they were tenacious. I mean,
yeah,
obviously, there's some stuff that happened later that wasn't too
mhm,
cool, but,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's very interesting. But,
How about the great tank battle at Kursk? I mean, they incredible tank battle where,
yeah.
the Panzer divisions were just like crushed by these Soviet tanks, and I mean they fought like bastards, the Soviets.
Oh, they did. They were
Yeah, I
tenacious
mean,
as hell.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I
But
mean, we
it's
could, yeah,
your backyard. It's like,
yeah,
not to go
yeah,
way off the rails here, but
mhm,
I've interviewed some people that live in Israel,
mhm,
and the guy that I interviewed, his name is Gavi. He's a great, great guy. I love him.
mhm,
And he said, it's a lot different. Like in America, you have a son or you go off to war, it's thousands of
mhm,
miles away. He said,
right,
we can go home for lunch.
right,
It's a lot, you have a lot different feel when it's
mhm,
literally in your backyard.
yeah, I believe that.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I'm
of
like,
course.
yeah,
Yeah,
that makes a ton
yeah,
of sense to me,
yeah, yeah,
and that's what the Russians were dealing with. It's like, oh
that's right.
shit, Hitler's
Yeah.
in our backyard right now. We got to do something about this.
Yeah, yeah. And the Russians were so there's a great story, and it is a departure from what we're talking about, but it's a great story where it was either uh uh gosh, who was the Russian general called? It was one of two guys who called Stalin, and they were sort of like at the German border. There were a couple of Nazis who reached out and wanted to talk. It was Zhukov or one of the Russian generals, and he called Stalin in the middle of the night, and he says they want to talk, and Stalin literally just hung up the phone. Yeah, yeah, it's
I,
too late for that. Yeah, keep the
yeah,
Stalin organs going. Yeah,
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 I don't doubt that. All right,
yeah,
let's get back to task
yeah,
here.
yeah,
Speaking of war, JFK,
mhm,
he's handpicked by dad.
yeah,
He's the anointed one. He's a
mhm,
war hero.
mhm,
Obviously we talked about this. Joe kind of had to crawl into bed with Sam Giancana. Get his kid
mhm,
elected, and
mhm,
Chicago it was between him and Nixon.
mhm,
And he's this war hero.
mhm.
He was in the Navy. There's the story of his boat that gets torpedoed, I think.
Yeah,
Somehow it
people,
gets
yeah,
sunk,
yeah, yeah.
and he's got injured men, and he literally is like not carrying, but they're swimming to an island, and the injured sailor is on his back.
No, he dragged them. He did,
Yeah,
Pat. So
yeah,
so this is incredible. I wanted to make sure I got this in, Patrick. I'm so glad you brought
yeah,
it up. So we could a lot of people might hate Kennedy's politics. And you might look back at it and say, "Oh, there were things he did wrong during his administration." But as a person, that's what I was making a point. As a
yeah.
person, I walked away with a tremendous fondness for Kennedy as a person. Forget about his politics for a moment. And during the war, no one could argue that he was one of the most heroic guys you could ever imagine. Um, he's bowed. He's in the Asiatic theater in the Pacific, South Pacific, and he gets literally sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer.
Hmm.
And the iron hull of the Japanese ship literally split in half the small mahogany hull of Kennedy's patrol boat.
Yeah, he's a
And he's
PT
got a
boat. Yeah.
yeah, PT boat, and he's got a small crew. And in the burning waters, burning fuel, the boat's in pieces. He's got to swim around, and he's swimming around yelling for his guys and finding them and dragging them over to pieces of floating debris. And then one guy he literally drags with his teeth, and at times he's swimming, and another guy I pointed out that he said, the guy I think was from Boston or something. He says, you're making a real display out here, splashing around. He goes, for a guy from Boston, you're embarrassing us, something to
Right.
that
Yeah.
effect.
Yep.
Yeah. And he wasn't doing it to disparage the guy. He was just trying to get the guy to like snap out of it and save himself
Yeah.
and help Kennedy save him. And, he wanted to like give him some courage. So, I mean, his courage is undeniable. And he literally comes home from the war a massive hero where his father can now market that in
Yes.
America, in the United States during the campaign and try to get him in. Say, look, my kid's a hero. Don't forget too, it needs to be mentioned. Joe Kennedy Sr.'s first pick for president was his son, Joe Jr., who was the oldest of the boys. Joe Jr. heroically died in the European theater
Right.
as a pilot. His plane exploded during a mission, during basically what amounted to almost a suicide mission that he decided he was gonna take.
Yep.
Um, and
It-
yeah, so he dies, and now all he's got is Jack left. Jack's next, rather, and Jack now is really a hero that he could market that heroism
yeah.
back home. So it
And
goes a
just
long way.
real quick with that story, they make it to an island. I just heard this recently on a different podcast. They make it to the island, and that island wasn't real habitable. I don't think
Mhm.
they had enough fresh water or food or whatever. So JFK swims to the next island
Yeah,
because
that's right.
to try, and
Yeah.
because he's obviously he's exhausted, he's dehydrated, he's starving, but to save his guys, he swims to another island,
In
and
shark infested waters.
yes, exactly, shark infested waters. He makes it to the other one, and then they all get rescued. So
Yep.
I mean, wow, you
Yep.
get chills
Wow.
just thinking about it. It's like
Chills. Yep.
that's what leadership is. That's what an
Yeah.
officer should be.
Yep. Yep.
It's like, wow, that's,
Mhm.
yeah, the guy was no saint, but you got to give
Yeah.
the devil his due with that.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
no doubt
So
about that.
before I go after him later in the book for a number of errors that he made while he was president, I wanted to make sure that I got that in to show that he was really, really a solid man of men. He was a hero, and I'm so glad you brought it up, Patrick, because it's such an important part of my writing to make sure that the reader knows. Look, he may have done some debacles later on, but let's not mix up that he was called treasonous later. I don't believe any of his actions were treasonous. I believe he made mistakes, but he was a patriot. He was an American patriot, and he showed that during the war. When he was eventually rescued from all of that swimming under the burning hot sun, dehydrated, hunger, and he finally is rescued by an Aussie, an Australian. And when they describe what he looked like, I mean, he looked like one of these guys who just went through that, the march of
Oh, the baton death
yeah, the
march. Yeah.
march of Bataan,
Yep.
exactly. He looks worse than them. And he did that to save his crew, and he saved them.
Yeah.
And that cannot be forgotten. I wanted to make sure I got it in because later on I could be hard on him, but I wanted to make sure that we never forget as a person, he was a heroic, patriotic American. He just might have been categorized as something else by his enemies, and that might have led to his death. But I wanted to make sure that, regardless of what I may think of his policies myself, I have to look at it objectively. And as a person, he was never anything but a hero.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah,
So
yeah,
then you have another piece of the puzzle here, and that's Bobby Kennedy. He
yeah.
was thought of as a slacker, a
Mhm,
wimp. He was kind of
mhm,
smaller in
mhm, mhm,
stature, where
mhm.
you got to look up you have to live up to the Kennedy persona. You know, they're men's men. You know,
Mhm,
it's like, God, this
mhm,
guy's, you know, your older brother is a war freaking hero, and then the other
mhm,
one is a war hero too. He dies like in
mhm,
this suicide mission, and he's
mhm,
kind of like a pansy. You know,
mhm,
he just didn't live up to that Kennedy persona. You know,
mhm, mhm,
how much of that do you think had
mhm.
influence in, you know, he's going after the Teamsters, Jimmy
A
Hoffa,
lot, a
etc.
lot, a lot. Yeah, so he walks away from the war with a major chip on his shoulder. He wants to do something in the war like his brothers. One dies, one almost dies, and then he's the third guy in line. And he basically is desperate to get into the war, be in action, and do something heroic, and he's not, and he doesn't get that opportunity. He's stationed, I think, in the Caribbean. He
Yeah,
never makes it into battle, and his close friends said that anytime anyone brought up the war or what they did in the war and Bobby was present in during the conversations, he would become very, very quiet and basically, it left a big chip on his shoulder that he couldn't throw himself into the conversation and say, "This is what
hmm
I did." And that left a
yeah,
major chip on his shoulder. He was also a Harvard Law reject. And
right, yeah,
yeah, which is also bothered him. I mean, the Kennedys go to Harvard. And Bobby didn't have the grades. I can't say he wasn't smart enough because a lot of people are smart but don't apply themselves.
right,
Whatever the case was, he may not have applied himself, or maybe he wasn't smart enough, but whatever the case was, he's a Harvard Law reject, and that's unacceptable in the Kennedy clan, the Kennedy family. You cannot, we go to the best schools. We're part of the best, and now it's a little embarrassing. So he's got two chips on his shoulder now, and when he becomes this mob chaser, I felt like, he was going to prove himself. He was going to take down and destroy the mob, and he said it repeatedly, and it made him feel tough. You could see when he basically cross-examines a guy like Sam Giancana in front of national cameras. He tells him, "You're a little girl. You giggle like a little girl, Mister
oh yeah,
Giancana.
yep,
He's pointing out that Giancana, hey, are you a sissy? That's basically what Bobby's saying. And I quoted another woman who wrote a book about the Kennedy family, the psychology of the Kennedy family. And she said to call someone a woman was the lowest thing you could do in the Kennedy family. And basically, Bobby called Giancana a little girl, so that he got a kick out of like demeaning them in public. And because nothing was done in response, I think he just kept going. And he felt like, the mob can't do anything. We're above them. We have more power than them. And he just kept going after them. And at times, Jack Kennedy was like, he shrugs it off, whatever you want to do, Bobby, that's fine. But Joe Kennedy at times did not like Bobby going after the mob, and
mm,
he disliked it, and he told him so. And there were times also where people in the Justice Department said that Bobby would be on the trail of, let's say, either a mobster or a mob connected Teamster local. And he would find that the trail led somehow to Joe Kennedy. In one instance, there was a Teamster local that rented its offices. And Bobby felt like, well, who's renting them these offices? There's something going on here. And they found out it was his father. And then Bobby would quiet down and say, let's just kill the investigation. I don't want to go any further.
mm,
And they would kill it because he didn't want to continue if the trail went back to his dad. So time and again, if the Cal Neva Lodge, if he followed up on the Cal Neva Lodge, he would find out that his father was meeting with mobsters at the Cal Neva Lodge. His father maybe had partners that were mobsters in the
yeah.
Cal Neva Lodge, and he didn't really want to go that far. So it was a bit hypocritical, and the mob didn't like it because of that. But Bobby just didn't stop, and he had this chip on his shoulder, as you said, as you rightfully pointed out, and he didn't. He was relentless in his crusade against the mob. I think It was to make up for that chip. It was to fill that hole, that void.
Yeah, it seems like Bobby had just a special, special hate, or he just wanted to really go after Jimmy Hoffa. Why? What was the connection
Yeah.
there?
So Hoffa defied him during the committee, the rackets committee. Hoffa would spit back at him, and he called him names. He
Ah,
would refer to him, yeah, all the time, and he would refer to him as a little rich boy and a little spoiled brat. And yeah, so Bobby's a bit jealous of Hoffa because Hoffa came up on his own,
mm,
and Hoffa's a bit jealous of Bobby because Hoffa had such a rough life and Bobby had it easy. So they were very, very similar, their characters. And that's why they became arch nemesises. And, Bobby was dead set on destroying Hoffa, and he kept recommending him for prosecution. And Hoffa was able to duck all of those recommendations. And then he said, though, if Jack becomes president, and I'm done, I'm in the soup. And not only did he, but then Bobby's attorney general and Hoffa knew he was done. And he knew that Bobby would pick up where he left off. And that's exactly what he did. So he started going after Hoffa, and he created what was referred to as the Get Hoffa Squad, where normally, like, you have crimes and then you investigate the crimes and you expose the culprits. That's how a normal investigation usually occurs, transpires. Bobby said, we're going to go after Hoffa. We're going to target Hoffa and then find out what the crimes are. And it was sort of like, one of the first times in American history where a man was targeted with such resources as the entire United States government. And they were going to uncover every rock and stone in his life until they found enough to put him away. And that's what Bobby was doing to Hoffa. So Hoffa despised him. So Hoffa started making comments where he was talking to people saying, this Bobby's got to die. He's got to get killed. It's me or him. And then Hoffa's close friends with, don't forget, Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, those three, Hoffa, Marcello, and Trafficante, being the only three in the mob who went against the rest,
Right.
against Kennedy. They backed Johnson first in the primary and Nixon in the general election. So those three now start to talk about killing Bobby. Trafficante, Marcello, and Hoffa. And there's a lot of other mobsters who are talking about it too. First, they're talking about killing Bobby, and at some point, the conversations start to turn, and they start to talk about killing Jack. And the reason being, according to Carlos Marcello, was if we kill Bobby, Jack will send out the National Guard for us.
Sure.
If we kill Jack, Bobby's disempowered overnight. And that's what we need to do. And that's sort of like where the mob's stance was. Now, there were other people who wanted to kill Jack by then as well, some being rogue members of the United States government, and some being the Cuban exiles who wanted to take back Cuba. And if you want it, I could explain how that happened.
Oh, we'll go into it later. Yeah, we'll definitely go into that later. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on, there is an extra special, hatred between Bobby and Jimmy Hoffa. And as JFK would say, Bobby went after him with great vigor.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so, that's great.
But then Frank Sinatra and the mob. There's always Don Rickles would laugh about it and make jokes about it. It was always that underlying. It's like, then I remember asking my mom when I was like, was he? No, he's not a mobster. And I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't know, but I didn't realize he was like their unofficial liaison.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he was. And so just quick, I'm glad you mentioned Don Rickles. Don Rickles made fun of it.
By the way.
Oh, man, he was incredible.
Yep.
And he made fun of Italians, blacks, Jews, everybody.
Yep.
And we all just laughed. If he was making fun of Italians, I remember watching old clips. I was hysterical. And I don't think any of my black or Jewish friends had a problem with him making fun of blacks and Jews either. We live in such a sensitive environment now where Don Rickles could never be a comedian today. Yeah,
not at all.
Then Hollywood would never even accept him within their borders. They would escort him to the border of Los Angeles and tell him, get the hell out.
Oh,
you're
absolutely.
not allowed to.
Yeah. You're right. And my ex-wife actually cooked for Don Rickles. This is completely unrelated. And I said, how, the restaurant, she was working at a high-end restaurant in Madison. He was there for a show. And of course, they gave him the best seat in the house. They treated him like a king. He says, who's the cook? Who's the chef? So my wife comes out and he's like, you're a hockey puck. Ha ha ha. He slaps her cheek and he gives her like $100. Yeah. I mean, he was very generous, just a sweetheart of a man.
Yeah, that's right. And he made fun of everybody. And I think, that's the old America that I liked, because we weren't at each other's throats, but there was a lot of comedy. And I felt like the different ethnicities got along great. They all worked together. They all intermarried. Most of my friends and relatives married outside Italians. They either married Irish, they married Germans, they married black, Spanish, you name it, they married it. And now it's like everybody's at each other's throats, but we're not allowed to have comedy.
Right.
So it,
Well, Don Rickles, I remember seeing an interview with him. This is a long time ago, and he said, if you're going to start making fun of other people, the first person you should make fun of is yourself.
right. That's great.
If you can't make fun of yourself and like
Right.
really dig in there, then you
Yep.
have no right to make fun of anybody else.
That's great. That's
And he
great. That's
said,
great.
make fun of everybody,
Right.
everybody. And then,
Mhm.
but you know what? I'm a huge Seinfeld fan.
Yeah,
And
me too.
Seinfeld was able to do that with that show where
Mhm.
nobody was off limits. Everything was on the page. But you know what? There was no venom in it. There wasn't like hate.
No.
It was funny. It was
It
comedy.
was great. Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. So that said,
Yeah.
um, yeah, so Frank Sinatra becomes the ambassador to the mob. That's basically his unofficial
How did
name.
that happen?
Yeah.
You
So
know?
basically, Sinatra becomes one of the greatest entertainers at the time,
Right.
and he's loved, and he's got 1,000,000 fans and followers, um, and he's, before the word influencer, right, came about, he's an influencer,
Sure.
and he could basically, what he says to his fans will follow, and so the Kennedys are very close with him, and they love him. And Jack Kennedy especially loved that Frank Sinatra was this guy who paints the town red, fools around with a lot of women,
Yep.
passes. He was a quote unquote girl passer. And Sinatra would sleep with a woman and then pass her on to another guy, a friend, and and Jack Kennedy was kind of like into the same thing. So he loved Frank Sinatra, loved hanging out with him, and there were girlfriends that Kennedy had that he shared with Frank Sinatra and with top mobsters. So this is something that Kennedy sort of loved Sinatra, loved the crazy lifestyle of this wacky entertainer who lives this like wild, reckless lifestyle. And the Rat Pack, it's like, you got Dean Martin, you got Sammy Davis Jr., you got a guy who's related to the Kennedys, as part of the Rat Pack. And they're all like chilling and hanging out in Vegas and having a ball. And Kennedy liked that. So they become
Okay.
close with Sinatra. But Sinatra also always had mob friends. When Sinatra was starting out in New Jersey, Willie Moretti, who was one of Frank Costello's main guys, got him a lot of gigs in nightclubs that he
Mm.
owned and made sure that Sinatra had the starring singing role in a lot of nightclubs when he had no work. And
Oh,
he
okay.
always, yeah, so the mob always backed Sinatra. And then when Sinatra got tied into this recording contract with the Dorsey band, Tommy Dorsey, I think it was, and he couldn't get out of it. Dorsey says, there's no way you're getting out of it. They sort of did a play on it in the Godfather movie.
Okay.
Willie Moretti basically told Dorsey, you're either letting him out or we're letting him out. Which one do you want? Basically, yeah, you decide. And Dorsey let him out of the contract. And there's
Okay.
people who said, oh, it didn't happen. But it seems that it did because Frank Sinatra couldn't get out of that contract for his life. And then he did. And apparently there's something to the rumors that said Moretti got involved. And back then, if Moretti sent you word, or said something to you, Moretti was a killer and was eventually killed himself, Willie Moretti. I cover that in volume 1 of the Borgata trilogy.
Right.
But
Which
Moretti basically,
happens with most mobsters. You rise to power, and then like before you know it, there's a bullet coming your way.
yeah. I look at Patrick. I wasn't as big as Moretti, but if I had a problem with you and I told you, look, you're either gonna, you know, sell your item to so and so. If you owned, let's say, a distributorship of some sort, and you were based in my neighborhood, if I went over there and said you're either going to sell your item to my friend or you're going to die, I mean it's an ultimatum.
Right.
You're going to, I mean, you have to go home and scratch your head and figure out, is it worth it?
Right.
And what are you going to do? You're going to kill me or lock me up, but someone's going to come after me.
Now,
You
was
know,
Frank Sinatra ever like an official member of the mafia, or
no,
he was
no. So
always on the outside? He was always kind of like on
yeah,
the fringe, right?
yeah. And he became very close. So first with Moretti, and then he sort of goes from the New York mob, very close with Frank Costello, Willie Moretti. And at some point, he befriends Sam Giancana,
Mm.
and he becomes very close with the Chicago mob through Sam
Okay.
Giancana, and loves Chicago, right? My kind of town, Chicago. I
Sure.
think, yeah, and he's got New York, New York. He sung a song for each, right?
Yep.
So he loves He loves Chicago and the Chicago mob, becomes very close with Sam Giancana, hangs out in Vegas with Giancana, partners with Giancana, and is able to convince Giancana to back the Kennedys. That was a big, big deal.
Okay.
Um, and then he stays the ambassador to the mob until Joe Kennedy Sr. has that stroke. And that's when basically Joe is left to deal with Jack and Bobby. Jack's an easygoing guy. Talk to Bobby. He goes to talk to Bobby, and Bobby doesn't want to hear nothing. You know, Bobby's got a stick up his ass, and he's not taking it out.
Right.
He's got a hard on. In plain English, he's got a hard on for the mob, and he's not backing down. And if Frank Sinatra will just be another casualty after Sinatra confronts Bobby. Bobby not only shuts down the plea from Sinatra on behalf of the mob, but he also then doubles down on his investigations into the mob. And he also tells Jack had an upcoming event, White House event. He tells him, get him off the guest list. So Sinatra's now disinvited,
Ooh.
persona non grata. And Sinatra was expecting Jack at one of his houses where Sinatra built a helipad for Marine One. And
God.
Jack canceled the trip and decided to hang out with Bing Crosby and landed in Bing's yard. So, Sinatra was really, really now. I mean, Sinatra hated Bobby as much as Bobby hated Sinatra now.
Oh, okay.
So, Sinatra was at that point, he went back to the mob and he's hoping he doesn't get clipped for his mistake.
Right.
He's going, look, I'm sorry. No one's listening to me. Sinatra must have at some point said to the mob, do what you got to do. I can't help you. I
Sure.
understand how these things work and I've exhausted my own, avenues and it's up to you guys now. I don't want any part of this. And I think Sinatra stepped back. And at that point, the mob despises Kennedy and they want Bobby dead. But I think they realize at some point, according to J. Edgar Hoover's eavesdropping devices, there's a switch at some point where they start saying Jack needs to die. And I don't think they had a problem with Jack, but I think they knew that in order to stop Bobby, you need to stop Jack. If you kill Bobby, Jack's going to come after you.
Yeah.
And
You
you
know,
got to, yeah.
yeah, speaking of J. Edgar Hoover, who led the FBI for I don't know how long. So you got J. Edgar Hoover, the Kennedys, and the mob, and especially illegal wiretaps. He had a lot of illegal wiretaps and other illegal activities from the FBI. Could you kind of go over that a little bit and how, like you said, there's these illegal wiretaps and there's conversations about killing JFK, and he did nothing about it. He just sat on his hands.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, great, great, great piece of history. Where do I begin? So J. Edgar Hoover, I believe, other than sitting on his hands and allowing Jack to die, if you were to remove that up until that point, you could almost argue that Hoover was a patriotic American and didn't go after the mob out of patriotism. And I'll explain because
Okay.
it's a tough pill to digest without knowing the details. So Hoover, a lot of people like to say that the mob had something on Hoover. That's why Hoover never went after him. He had pictures of him where he was exposed either right at that time. Now, nobody cares if you're gay in America.
Right.
We all have people in our family and friends that are gay. It's okay. It's acceptable. But back then it was unacceptable in the 1960s. You could not move up in a company if you were gay. You would be smeared. You wouldn't get anywhere.
You couldn't be the head of the FBI. That's for sure.
Definitely not. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That would be done.
Right.
And exactly. So a lot of people try to say, well, the mob had evidence that Hoover was gay and he was sleeping with Clyde Tolson, who was the assistant director. And look, they vacationed a lot together.
Right.
There were a lot of things that would point towards them having a relationship. So it's quite possible they did. There were photographs of them clothed where they almost look like they're on their honeymoon together.
Yeah.
So something, again, that's very acceptable today. We have no problem with it as Americans. But back then, that's something that was unacceptable. And so you would think that it makes sense. The mob might have had some photos of them together, and maybe that's what they were holding over his head. But I did a deep dive into those rumors, and I found that there was no evidence to suggest that they were real. And they also started with a socialite who didn't like Hoover and
Mm.
said, oh, the mob's got pics of him. And then a journalist ran with it, and then another author and another historian, and so on down the line. So all these books then would basically source the last book as their
Oh,
source. They
okay.
would reference the
Okay.
last book as their
Yeah, yeah.
source. Yeah. So I have no real evidence of that. And nothing's ever come out. So why then did Hoover leave the mob to itself? So that you have to ask why. Were they bribing him? So what I found was that Hoover Hoover never believed that the mob was a threat to American politics, to American institutions, to the American way of life. The mob were patriotic. If you remember in volume one of the Borgata trilogy, they helped the Navy
Yes,
during
that
World
that
War
shocked
II.
me. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They were patriotic Americans. Um, so they helped the mob. I'm sorry, the mob helped the Navy. U.S. Naval Intelligence said, "Look, we've got Nazi U-boats floating around in the Atlantic, and we don't need them here. And we're afraid that they're gonna, if they sabotage the shipments we're sending to Europe, we're the arsenal of the democracies. We're keeping Britain alive alone, and then eventually we also supplied Stalin. And if we stop these shipments, we could lose the war." And they went to the mob who controlled the eastern seaboard, the waterfront, and not only the Northeast, but all the way down. And they said, look, can you help us? And the mob said, no problem. We're patriotic Americans. We're not friends of Mussolini. We may have come from Italy, but Mussolini's just a shithead to us. We'll back you.
Right.
And they did. And they hated Hitler. And a lot of mobsters also joined the military. Albert Anastasia taught. He joined the military and taught people. Matty the Horse Ionello was a tail gunner, a decorated tail gunner. There were a lot of mobsters who joined the army and the Navy. And my own grandfather took numbers in a bar and was in a union that was controlled by the mob and got in through his
Mm.
mafia connections. My own grandfather, and he won 8 Bronze Stars in the Asiatic Pacific.
Holy cow.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I have the discharge papers. I have his discharge papers where it says 8 Bronze Stars.
That's amazing.
Um,
That's
yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the medals. They were lost, but I have the
yeah.
discharge papers that say it. I should put them online one day because somebody once questioned me and go, "Oh yeah, 8 Bronze Stars, impossible." 8 Bronze Stars. It's in his discharge papers.
Wow.
There's also clippings of my grandfather when a kamikaze hit his ship. He was given an award for outstanding heroism in action against enemy Japanese forces, and he came home and he took numbers at a bar. I mean, but he was a patriotic American.
Right.
It was a different day and age.
It
So
was
the
totally
mob,
different. Yes.
yeah. So the mob were patriots, and they did help. So Hoover knew. Hoover knew. Look, the mob isn't a threat to American institutions. So who is a threat? Hoover focused on communism, on the communist threat. He believed that was the biggest threat to American institutions and to the American way of life. If the commies win, we may lose everything. And that was basically Hoover's outlook at the time. He wrote several books on the communist threat in
Mm.
America. So when Bobby comes along and says the mob is the biggest threat, Hoover's scratching his head going, what are you talking about? The mob works within the democratic capitalist system. They're not a threat to the system. They may be a threat to the economy because prices may go up because they're shaking people down. They may be a pain in the ass to deal with, but they're not a threat. They don't want to overturn the American Republic. That's not something that they wish to do. They wish to keep it going as long as possible. And you could also argue that they were sort of a pressure valve at times when, during Prohibition, when the American public hates the government for not giving them liquor and feels that the government is treating them like children, the mob comes along and says, here's as much liquor as you
Yeah,
need.
that's true. Yeah.
So, I mean, like they basically may have averted a revolution, like you could
Yeah,
argue.
but with J. Edgar Hoover's, FBI, the ends justify the means.
Yeah.
That's where I have the problem. Being in law enforcement for 25 years, and it's like, no, you still have to wake up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror.
Mhm.
It's like I never violated the Constitution.
Right.
That's our playbook,
Yeah.
and he did it, on a whim.
He
You know, and,
did.
and also, I just get a kick out of, it's like to be an FBI special agent. Obviously you have to be a manly man. You have to be
Mhm.
like 6 foot or
Mhm.
taller, and a
Mhm.
full head of hair. And I'm like, boy,
Yeah.
I would never get picked.
I'm out for both of those.
Yeah.
Both of us, yeah, both of
You and
us
me
would be
both would
scratched.
never make it, Lou.
Scratched.
Yeah.
Scratched. Yep. So yeah, I mean he was so let me I guess I got to put it in perspective. So patriotic American in the sense that he wants to preserve the American way of life as it was and the way he saw it. That said, he broke a lot of rules and he definitely violated the Constitution time and again.
He sure
And he
did.
especially, yeah, and he especially did it with Jack's death.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, he was a bad guy, and there's no denying that. I mean, there are books upon books that have written about him, and he's literally though. So this is his argument with Bobby, just so we know how he feels about the mob.
Yeah.
He's listening to these eavesdropping devices that are illegal, so he doesn't tell Bobby he has them, and he hasn't gotten a court order to get them. So they're illegal black bag jobs, which is a violation of the Constitution right there
Yep.
in itself, in and of itself. You're not allowed to tap people illegally, bug their private residences or private
Right.
places of business.
Absolutely.
And he does it every day. So now he's listening to these and he's listening to people saying, hey, the mayor's ours. Hey, that governor, we put him in. Hey, that congressman, he's all ours. We put him in there. And he's saying, okay, Bobby, how far do you want me to follow the mob?
Yeah.
Do you want me to
Right.
follow them all the way back to Washington, D.C.? Would you like my agents to surround the Capitol Rotunda and tell everyone to come out with their hands up? Because if we do a deep dive into the mob, it leads one place, and that's Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And it also leads to your father. How far do you want to go? Every
Right.
time Bobby got close to his father, he backed off. Do you want J. Edgar Hoover to go and follow the trail right to your dad? Do you want Hoover to follow the trail that says the election was stolen in Chicago? So Hoover's scratching his head going, okay, if we're patriotic Americans, how far do you want to go? Do you want to take down the entire government and then just overturn everything? Because that's where it leads. So Hoover's trying to, I think, teach Bobby by example that the mob's only going to lead one place. A good forensic accounting of the mafia's money will lead one place, and it's called Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
just like, yeah, I mean, look at what Trump's doing with Doge right now.
Yeah.
Whether you like it or don't, he's uncovering billions of dollars in fraudulent spending. And you know, I mean, Hoover would have said to Trump if Hoover was there, let's not really go there. You know, that was sort of Hoover's stance.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, so that's sort of like, so yes, on one hand, you could argue that he was patriotic. He wanted to preserve the American way of life. On the other hand, you don't violate the things he had done with anytime he targeted an individual. Hoover was reprehensible. I
Yes.
mean, yeah, I mean, whoever it was, whether it was even Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, he violated his civil rights time and again, the Reverend Martin Luther
Yes.
King. So, you know, you could argue that he did disperse with civil liberties whenever he wished to, and the eavesdropping devices are the clearest point. But he didn't want to go near the mob, and that's why. I think
Okay.
he didn't feel they were a threat, and he wondered why Bobby would want to shake that beehive.
Well,
And
yeah, and there was no love between Bobby and J. Edgar Hoover. That's
they
for sure.
hated each other. They
Yeah.
despised each other. So Bobby
Yep.
not only wanted to remove Hoover in Jack's second term. The first he wanted to remove him in the first term, and then Jack decided, look, let's leave him.
Yeah.
We'll leave Allen Dulles of the CIA and J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI. We'll leave them in place because it's the old guard, and we don't want to uproot everything. We don't want to disrupt too many people in Washington. We just got here. So they left Dulles at the CIA and Hoover at the FBI. At some point, they forced Dulles to resign. So Dulles is sacked, and Hoover swore that he was next. So, and Bobby was swearing to everyone around him, Hoover is next. He's going next. We're going to get rid of Hoover too. We'll retire him. We'll wait till Jack's second term and we'll get rid of him. Now, what I found, what I never knew, and this goes back to the homosexual thing, Bobby wanted to smear Hoover as a homosexual.
Hmm.
And he had people doing a deep dive into Hoover's personal life. And this came out from an assistant director. And I never knew that myself. I was like, oh my gosh, that's the worst thing you could have did. So he's threatening, and it got back to Hoover, by the way. It got back to Hoover that Bobby was trying to smear him as gay. And just as you said, you can never be the head of the FBI if you're gay. Hoover
Right.
would have been done, not in the 60s.
Yeah,
Now,
all day
okay,
long.
fine. Yeah,
All
all
day
day
long.
long, done.
Yep.
So at that point, I felt like when Hoover found out that Bobby was not only trying to get rid of him as FBI director, a position he's held for decades, but also trying to smear him as a homosexual, I think at that point Hoover wanted Bobby and Jack. If somebody felt like killing them and I happen to have the information in front of me, I didn't see anything. I think
Yeah.
that was Hoover's decision at that point, which was obviously not patriotic. But
Right.
if you look at it, the dilemma that he was in, you could at least say it was wrong. But from Hoover's point of view, we can understand where he was coming from in his own mind.
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that makes sense.
Mhm.
So let's kind of move forward here. The mob and the Bay of Pigs connection,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
hiring hitmen to take out Castro. This
Yeah.
is fascinating
Yeah.
history here.
Yeah, you can't make this up. It's
No.
incredible. So the mafia wants Castro. The mafia despised Castro. So if you remember in Borgata: Rise of Empire, I went through the different ways they got into Havana through Fulgencio Batista, who was the leader of Havana, a leader of Cuba, and he allowed the mob to take over Havana through Myelansky, and Myelansky brought all of the Italian bosses in with him as partners. So they basically locked down Havana, Cuba for themselves. And it's a couple of $1 billion a year, the industry, the gambling industry there, and it's all to themselves. And Americans are using Cuba as sort of like a vacation spot.
Sure. Yeah.
It's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Yeah, popping over there every once in a while, going to the casinos, the hotels. Like people would go to Paradise Island now. They're enjoying themselves and they're coming home. So the mob controls all that. Castro comes down from the Sierra Maestra Mountains, ousts Batista. Batista gets on a plane and flees with a lot of money, and he gets the hell out of there. And then Castro pushes the mob. He pushes them out too. And the mob has to leave Cuba. He calls them American fascists and fascist gangsters. So he gets rid of them. So the mob goes back home, back to America, and they're angry at Castro. So the CIA knows that the mob would love to have their little fiefdom in Havana back.
Yeah.
So they would decide at some point, look, we'd love to see Castro dead. Let's approach the mob and ask them if they'll do it. And we could sort of have like a layer of insulation and have plausible deniability if anything backfires. Let the mob clip them. So they go to a guy named Johnny Roselli, who was a Chicago gangster who was sort of farmed out to the LA mob for a while and dealt a lot with the production companies down there with labor relations. And then at some point they redirected him, the Chicago mob did, to Las Vegas, where he was sort of the ambassador to Las Vegas for the mafia. And Roselli's doing a lot of stuff, and he meets a guy down in Vegas named Mayu, Robert Mayu. And Mayu has a relationship with the CIA. So the CIA approaches Mayu at some point and says, look, you know any mobsters we could do business with? And he goes, there's a guy, Johnny Roselli. You'd never believe he's a mobster. I mean, this guy's a classy guy. If I put you in his presence, you wouldn't believe he was a gangster. None of that bada boom, bada bing
Yeah.
stuff. He's typical straight edge guy comes across as, but behind it all, behind the facade, he's a ruthless gangster. So he says, great. So Mayu introduces Sheffield Edwards to Roselli, Johnny Roselli, and Roselli says, "You got to be kidding me! The United States government wants us to kill somebody. You guys are the guys who come after us for killing people." He can't even believe it.
Right.
So after Mayu convinces him that it's real, he then, in turn, says, "Well, look, I got to bring in my boss, Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana is the acting boss of the Chicago mob. I got to bring him in because I got to report to my boss. I got to put it on record." And that goes back to like if I was on the street and I'm going to do a big heist, and let's say it's in someone's territory, I got to go to my skipper, my captain, and tell him, look, just so you know, this is what I'm doing. This way it's on record. Nobody says, Louis, why'd you do this? And they look to kill me later. So
Right.
you put it on record. So Roselli tells Mayu, I got to put it on record. And he puts it on record with Giancana. So then they're going to be working with Cubans who still have access to Cuba and access to Castro. And who runs all the Cubans are based in Florida at the time. So who runs Florida? Santo Trafficante. So Giancana says, look, I'm in, but if we're going to be working with Cubans, we got to go now to Santo Trafficante. So there's like mob protocol that's
Okay.
being exercised here. So they go, look, we got to go to Trafficante and let him know. So then Giancana and Roselli go to Trafficante and tell him, look, we're going to need some of these Cubans that are in your thing over here, your area. And a lot of Cubans were in now Trafficante's Borgata. They were working closely. A lot of the Cubans landed in Miami, and they were tough guys. They, a lot of them were hardworking Cuban Americans. They became honest, hardworking Cuban Americans who made tremendous lives for themselves in America, and they've been a great asset to us in our country. But a lot of them were just tough Cubans who got in with the mob, and also a lot of those tough Cubans were trained by the CIA to take back Cuba. They wanted to go in there and launch an invasion of the island. So Trafficante, being in the midst of these Cubans, was brought into the plot. So now you got Roselli, Trafficante, and Giancana working directly with the CIA. And they were supposed to kill Castro at the same time the CIA-trained Cuban Exile Brigade launches an invasion of the island. So Castro would be killed as the brigade moves inland and takes Havana. This was the theory on paper that would transpire. And the CIA came up with this whole thing. So at some point, the Bay of Pigs is what we now know as the Bay of Pigs, the Bahina Cochinas, which was the Bay of Pigs. That's where the CIA determined that the invasion they would hit the beaches. There would be different sections of the brigade, different squads of the brigade would attack certain parts of the beach, certain sections of beach, almost like Normandy. You had the Brits landed here, the Americans landed here, right? The Canadians were here. So you have the same thing here. They're planning. So they're planning this invasion, and the mob is supposed to kill Castro at the same time, simultaneously. So the mob says the best way to do it is to get us poisons, and we'll get the Cubans that are returning to Cuba to bring the poisons and get them into Castro. First, they toyed around with different ways to poison Castro, through his cigar, through his beard, through a pill, licking an ice cream cone. He'll lick himself to death. There was all these ridiculous ways. But one way or another, they were going to kill Castro. So they believe it's in the works. And right before the Bay of Pigs is launched, the invasion, the brigade, the Cuban brigade, CIA-backed Cuban brigade, is ready to launch the invasion. And Kennedy makes a public press stance where he says in front of the media, he says, look, America will have no hand in this because the newspapers are reporting the imminent invasion. And Kennedy can't even believe it, that you could pick up the newspaper and read about the secret invasion. He can't even believe it. So he's pressed to call it off, but he's afraid to call it off because the Cubans are being thrown out of their training camp in Guatemala, where they were last being trained. And he feels if we have to then bring them back to Florida, where they'll start screaming, the president betrayed us, and it'll be a nightmare politically. Yep. So he says, let's go ahead with the invasion, but he makes a public stance where the United States will have no part in the invasion, if there is one. So now he basically tied the United States' hands. What are we supposed to do? So the CIA said to the Cuban brigade, don't worry. We know the president said that, but when push comes to shove and you guys hit the beaches, we'll twist his arm and we'll get the air cover that we need to support you as you move inland. Just go for it. We'll even get your troops if you need them. And we'll have the Navy right off the coast ready to help you. Just go. We'll twist the president's arm. So they launched the invasion. And first, there's this phony play that's part of the CIA plan where there's these bombers that were leftover American bombers from World War II, and they're repainted with Cuban insignias, like Cuban Air Force insignias. And those bombers bomb a few planes on the ground in Cuba, and then the rest of them fly off, and one pretends to defect to Miami, and he lands and says, hey, we just left Cuba. We defected from Cuba, and on our way out, we bombed a bunch of planes. And I got out with this one. Here I am in Miami. And the press was laughing. They're going, is he kidding us? That's an American bomber that was repainted like, crappy too. It's not even a good paint job. We know the Americans did this. So Kennedy literally shits. And he says, well, what am I going to do now? America's hand is revealed. I'm definitely not not doing anything now. So once the brigade lands on the beaches and Castro confronts them with his little red army, and he, they're overwhelmed. He's beating the crap out of them with Soviet MiGs, Soviet tanks,
Yep.
and they're pinned down on the beach. The CIA is begging Kennedy, please, we need air cover and we got to knock out the MiGs. And Kennedy said, no, I refuse. And they said, we can't leave them stranded. We train them and they're pinned down on the beach. Please, 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 Mr. President, we cannot. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the administration, members of the administration are all begging Kennedy. Charles Cabal, the assistant director of the CIA, because Allen Dulles was out of town conveniently. I think he anticipated a debacle
Sure.
and got the hell out of there. They're begging Kennedy. And Dean Rusk, they're going, please give us the air. You can't leave these guys stranded on the beach. And Kennedy said no. So they're also making the argument, well, why do you care so much if America's hand is revealed if he's got Soviet MiGs and Soviet tanks?
Right.
We could see the Russians are behind this, behind him. Why can't we be behind them? And he said, no, I refuse. So they leave the Cubans stranded on the beach. They get decimated. Whoever doesn't get killed is basically taken prisoner and tortured in Castro's despicable prisons, makeshift prisons that aren't really prisons. Sometimes there's 1,000 prisoners with one bathroom.
Right.
So they're sitting there, and it's a festering wound. And the Cuban communities hates and despises Kennedy for leaving their brethren on the beaches. And the members of Kennedy's administration and the Joint Chiefs and the CIA who wanted Kennedy to save them, they feel that his inaction was tantamount to treason. And they felt like, so that's why I wanted to make a strong case for Kennedy's patriotism in the beginning. I don't feel it was tantamount to treason. I feel it was a mistake. As a historian, I try to look at it objectively, but talking to you as a person, I feel like it was a major blunder on Kennedy's part, but I don't feel that at any point Kennedy was a treasonist. I don't feel that. I feel that's too lightly thrown at him. I just felt like he thought he was doing the right thing and he screwed up.
Well, he obviously knew about the nuclear stuff, and it's like, okay, do I really want to go to battle with the Soviets? I think
Correct.
that's what his thinking was, right, wrong, or indifferent. I thought it
Correct.
was wrong because we
Mm,
trained these guys up, we promised them all this stuff,
mm,
and one push came to shove, we didn't support them. And they either died or, had horrible, horrible existences because of it.
mm,
And, I interviewed Rick Prado a while ago. He
mm,
was very high up in the CIA chain of command. He wrote a
mm,
great book called Shadow Warrior. It's
mm,
fantastic.
mm,
And he's a proud Cuban American. And
mm,
he was born in Cuba, and he was a little kid when Batista was thrown out and Castro,
mm,
bulldozed his way in.
mm, mm,
And he said, he knows people that knows that there were aircraft carriers just waiting
mhm,
to give these people support. If they had
mhm,
aerial support, they would have just bulldozed over them.
mhm,
If they had the
mhm,
right support from
mhm,
the air, and Kennedy's like, no, like you said, it's like these guys are gonna die, Mr. President, and he's
mhm.
like, nope.
Yeah,
So that's where that festering wound comes from. That's where
yeah,
that hate comes
yeah,
from.
yeah. And I could totally sympathize with the people on the beach, with the Cuban community, Cuban American community, with the members of the administration who wanted him to act, because as worried as he was about getting into a war with the Soviets, I mean, Kennedy was terrified of confronting them in Berlin. You had
Yep.
East and West Berlin, Southeast Asia. If they keep poking their nose out from behind the Iron Curtain, we're going to have to deal with the Soviets in so many other places, and he feared that. But I just felt like if America, I have to agree with the people who felt if America went to these such great lengths to train these people and promise them the support, that you have to follow through. You can't leave
Yep.
them on the beach.
you
And
you can't leave somebody hanging like that.
no,
It's like, oh, and the pilots on these aircraft carriers were just itching to get out there and get
yeah,
into the fight.
yeah, I agree. So I agree with all that. The only thing I differ from is I think treason is a word we have to very carefully use.
Yeah.
Treason means like someone who sells nuclear secrets
Right, to the
to another
Soviets
country.
or to
Yeah,
China or
that's
something.
treason.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's treason. I think if somebody does no matter how wrong his intentions may be, I think if they're done with good intentions, I think it's tough to call someone a treasonist.
Yeah.
I think that's tough. Benedict Arnold committed treason. I don't think Jack Kennedy did. I think what he did was despicable,
Yes.
but it's tough to make that jump for me and say it's treason. Yeah.
Okay, let's push forward to the demise of the Kennedys.
Yeah.
Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, and the mob.
Yeah.
Lee
Yeah.
Harvey
Well,
Oswald, interesting
mm,
character. I'm glad you
mm,
went through it like you did.
mm,
I didn't realize, I knew he was a Marine, but
uh-huh.
I didn't realize he defected to the Soviet Union and then poof, he came
Yeah.
back with a
Mhm,
Russian bride
mhm.
and we welcomed with open arms. How does that happen?
Yeah. Before that happens, don't forget there was the Cuban Missile Crisis too, where Kennedy
Right.
screwed up again. Now that you could argue even more if you're going to take the treason angle. You could argue that that was tantamount, people will argue, to treason. However, Kennedy once again blew it and then blamed it on, I didn't want to get into a nuclear war with the Soviets, he said. But again, the Joint Chiefs, members of his administration, were telling him, invade. There's nuclear missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida. We need to get them out of there. And they
Yep.
have a range for the entire United States. They could decimate us now with a push of the button. So Kennedy blew it once again. So I'm totally against Kennedy's policies and his decisions, and it comes across in the book. But I try to be as objective as possible. Um, Look, I didn't agree when they called President Donald Trump treason, 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 treason. I
Right.
said, wow, they just throw that word around so easily. It's despicable. So I didn't want to do it with Kennedy either. But um, that said, he blew it again. I mean, they were going, look, we have every right to get the missiles out of Cuba. This is our hemisphere. It's the Monroe Doctrine. We have every right to invade the island. We won't be seen as the imperialist mercenaries Castro keeps saying we are. We're defending our nation. We
Yeah.
must defend our nation. This was the argument. And Kennedy once again said, nope. And the Cuban exiles again were livid. They go, wow, did he let us down? I mean, he just like totally threw us in the trash. And then what Kennedy did after that was even worse. Kennedy said after that, not only am I defunding the Cuban exiles who want to take back their homeland, but he made a side deal with Khrushchev that not only would he not invade, but he would never allow for another invasion. So now he turns around and he classifies the Cuban exiles who were CIA trained to take back the island, who were the mascots of democracy, the champions of liberty up until this point. They suddenly become criminal targets of the Kennedy administration. He tells Bobby, lock them up wherever they're training. So now the Coast Guard is pulling them over at sea and arresting them. We're working with British authorities in the Bahamas to lock them up. And the Cuban exiles are going, what the F just happened?
Right.
We were the biggest champions of liberty. Now we're getting locked up in droves. And he's got us as criminals. So nobody could believe it. And so this is like one thing after another. I mean, Kennedy didn't know how to eat a Cuban sandwich. I
Yeah.
mean, he didn't know what the hell to do when it came to Cuba.
Right.
So he would have stuck one up his ass if you handed him one. I mean, he didn't know what to do with anything Cuban related. So he's now making one debacle after another. And now the Cuban exiles are considered criminal targets of the Kennedy administration. And what do? They get closer to the mob who picks up and has been funding them all along with the American government. The American government put a couple of $100 million into training the exiles and sabotage missions into Cuba, disrupting Fidel Castro's life in every which way. And now they defunded them completely. So the exiles who are broke, literally flat broke, got closer to the mob,
Mm.
Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, who quickly underwrote them and said, well, we'll fund you. So now the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Whether the Cuban exiles had any interest in mobsters or not, they realized that they are also enemies of the Kennedy administration. And so were the rogue CIA agents who despise Kennedy and feel like he should be removed from power as soon as possible. So you have the Cuban exiles, the CIA their CIA handlers and the mob all in one bed. I just wanted to make that important point
Yeah.
before we move on to Oswald and Ruby.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, let's go to Oswald and Ruby. You uncovered some stuff here that I didn't know and I found fascinating. Like I said before, he's a Marine. I
Mhm.
don't think his brain was put together all that great.
Mhm.
And, he goes to the Soviet Union. He defects to the Soviet Union, gets married, brings back his Soviet bride. And it's almost like, oh, okay. Yeah. No harm, no
Mhm.
foul, guys.
Mhm.
How does that
Exactly.
happen?
Little
Yeah.
weird. Little weird. So everything points to him being a defector. Defects to the Soviet Union, as you said, and it looks like he's studying communist literature. He learns Russian. Okay, the guy wants to be a communist. Okay, he goes to Russia. So far, everything makes sense.
Right.
Defected to Russia. They accepted him. They took him in for a while. But all of a sudden, he comes back and he has no problem coming back. And he's even given a loan by the State Department.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Right. Yeah. I forgot about that. Yeah.
what the hell is going on now?
Yeah.
So this doesn't make sense. So he should just come back to immediate trip to Leavenworth. I mean,
Yes.
you're going to jail, buddy.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Or we're gonna interrogate you. I don't know. Before we always had Guantanamo since Castro took over, but before it was like an offshore. It used to be just a naval place. But
Right.
let's say Guantanamo for argument's sake. You're going to Guantanamo for like a 6-month interrogation with no food and loud music playing.
Yep.
You're going to tell us everything you learned in the Soviet Union. No, he's welcomed back. He's helped to acclimate into a neighborhood. He's got CIA handlers around him. The FBI is keeping track of him, and he's basically, um, it's too strange for me. It's
Yes.
too strange. So you wonder if he was sent to the Soviet Union because first of all, Oswald, um, and you're right, his brain wasn't put together too well. He had nervous breakdowns in the military, so there he suffered from issues. But I do believe there was a part of him that was extremely intelligent because he learned Russian like faster than most of us could even learn like how to say hello and goodbye in Russian. He learned the entire language, and then he also worked at a air base in Japan that had something to do with U-2 missions. And
Mm.
he sort of was the smartest of the smart. He wasn't just like, okay, you're going to be a grunt who hits the beaches first if we invade somewhere. No, you're going to a top intelligence place and you're cleared. So they're using them for like brilliant stuff, but like a lot of people who are smart, their brains fall apart. You could.
Yeah.
There's a whole library of people who have
Yeah.
had nervous breakdowns and lose their
Right.
minds, who are really brilliant guys. A Beautiful Mind. The movie A Beautiful Mind was
Yep.
about a guy who was a brilliant guy who just couldn't keep it together. And there are so many people like that. But I think he was a smart guy who was a little bit on the loony side, and that helped in their argument later to say he was a lunatic, he was a lone nut. But something's happening, and there's also evidence in my book where Hoover sends a teletype to the CIA and says, "Look, somebody's impersonating this guy Oswald in different places." And this went back to 1961. Forget about
Mm.
63,
Yeah.
when he's supposedly floating around Mexico City, and we don't know if it's Oswald or not because the pictures that we received back here don't. It's not Oswald. And then Hoover says my agents that knew Oswald and were in contact with Oswald listened to the audio and saw the photos and said that's not Oswald. The audio is not him, and the photographs aren't him. So there's something wrong. But all the way back to 1961, Hoover was keeping an eye on him
Mm.
and said, somebody's impersonating Oswald. Somebody's looking to get. We have somebody here that's trying to get a birth certificate, and somebody here that's trying to get identification, and this isn't Oswald. So he's sounding the alarm, Hoover, at that time. So, and it's all sourced in my book. Again, I don't just throw these things out there.
Right.
You can go to the back of my book, look at the sources, and look them up yourself. This is evidence. So Oswald's a funny character, and then Oswald at some point he's from Louisiana, and he spends most of his time as a child between Louisiana and Texas, which is an adjacent state to Louisiana. They share a 370-mile border. Carlos Marcello is the Don of Louisiana, but he's also runs Texas, the Borgata in Texas, is under Marcello's control. And it's run by Joe Civillo and his underboss, Joe Campisi. Both of those guys kind of sort of answer to Marcello. Marcello is the big wig behind this all. And Marcello, basically, a bookmaker in his Borgata is Oswald's uncle. Not only that, there's another connection. So Oswald befriends a guy named David Ferry. So Bobby, I told you, had this hatred for Carlos Marcello.
Right.
And at some point or another, he said, I'm going to deport him. And he's either going back to Sicily, where he's originally from, or Tunisia, because Marcello's parents migrated to a Sicilian exile community in Tunisia. Or he's going back to one or the other, or maybe I'll just throw him in Asia. I'm just going to send him as far away as possible. This is what Bobby's doing, his plan.
Yeah.
At some point or another, Marcello's, and this is a big part of, this feeds into Oswald. So I'm just so you know, I'm not going off track here. This will feed into Oswald. At some point or another, Marcello says, well, I don't want to get sent across the Atlantic Ocean. The Don that I took over for was deported back to Sicily, and that's how I took over. He was too far away to keep control of his rackets. So I don't want that to happen. So he goes and gets a forged birth certificate from Guatemala. Marcello does. And once he has this forged birth certificate, he has a felony citizenship in Guatemala. So he figures, if Bobby deports me, at least I'll go to Guatemala. I'm just a hop and a skip from Louisiana, right across the Gulf. And I could pretty much control my Borgata from here. Guys could come back and forth to see me until I work my way back. So once he has this forged birth certificate and Bobby finds out about it, Bobby, who's the Attorney General of the United States, knows it's a fraudulent birth certificate and says, I'm going to use that to illegally deport him to Guatemala. So Bobby, knowing it's forged, tells the INS to deport him to Guatemala. First, he tells Hoover to get involved. Hoover says, I won't touch this with a 10-foot stick. Leave me alone. And then he gets this guy named General Swing, who's in charge of the INS. He tells General Swing, deport Marcello to Guatemala. They both know, General Swing and Bobby know, that it's a forged birth certificate, so they know that they're committing a fraud against the Guatemalan government by sending him there, but they do it anyway. So once he's in Guatemala, he works his way back through Honduras, 17-mile trek through the jungles, gets back to the United States, and when he re-enters the United States, Bobby tells all of the agents in Louisiana and Texas, find him, uncover every stone, and lock him up again, and double down, and we'll lock him up for illegal re-entry. So as soon as Marcello surfaces, they lock him up and they put him on trial. Now, Marcello hires a lawyer, and in that lawyer's office, a man by the name of David Ferry works for the lawyer. And that David Ferry becomes a big private investigator for Marcello through the attorney. And that guy becomes very close with Marcello. David Ferry is an eccentric character who was anti-Castro and worked with the CIA to fly sabotage missions into Cuba before Kennedy turned on the exiles. He despised Castro, Ferry did. Yeah. And then when Kennedy turned on the Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs and during the missile crisis, he started to curse Kennedy and say Kennedy needs to get killed. We need to get that SOB out of there. So now David Ferry hates Kennedy and wants to kill him. And the CIA people working with Ferry, we could assume, feel the same way. And CIA people working with Johnny Roselli feel the same way. That's in the book. And these people are all in one big basket now. So you have the CIA people who despise Kennedy, Carlos Marcello, who despises Kennedy, David Ferry, who despises Kennedy, and the Cuban exiles who despise Kennedy. They're all working together, and they're all being seen together at training camps in and around Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana and Florida. And they're all being seen together also at an office in Louisiana owned by a man by the name of Guy Bannister, who's a retired FBI agent. He put in 20 years with the FBI, and now he's an anti-communist, anti-Castro, anti-Kennedy guy. And he's working closely with Ferry. And guess who else is always seen in their office? Oswald. So Oswald is always seen with Ferry. And there's a picture of them together, by the way,
Yeah.
yeah, in the book. But these guys are all only one breath away from Carlos Marcello. Yeah, go ahead, Patrick. I thought you were going to hop
No,
in.
no, no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, that's basically so.
Oh,
So
okay. So
yeah, go
that's
ahead.
yeah. So Lee Harvey Oswald, again, he was, touted as the lone gunman, from, the Texas Book Depository, et cetera. And also he killed a police officer. That they had like the dragnet, trying to find who killed Kennedy, et cetera. And I forgot, or I didn't know that, he killed a police officer that just was in the wrong place at the wrong time, it seemed like.
So we're not sure. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that he did kill the officer,
Yeah.
and there's some witnesses that say it wasn't him. Someone else
Mm.
shot the officer. It was J.D. Tippit,
Yes.
and J.D. Tippit was he was killed, and it's sketchy as to exactly what happened. Just as we don't know if for sure if Oswald was the lone shooter or if he was even a shooter. And why I'll say that is people will jump at you and say, "No way, you're an idiot. Oswald shot him." We all know that. Well, if you look at the evidence, because I went into this thinking Oswald did it himself too.
Yeah.
I went into it like every other American who always hears the spiel and has never done a deep dive into it, has never read the books or reads the wrong books, because there are books that have been written by quote unquote government historians.
Well, yeah, and you got to be careful too, because there's a lot of
Yeah,
kooks out there and
yeah,
conspiracy theorists that are going to kind
I
of
agree.
dream up their own little worlds,
I agree.
and it's not factual. So I
I
guess
agree.
that's why I was always like, yeah, Lee Harvey Oswald did it, blah blah
Yeah,
blah,
yeah,
done. But the more you look into it, you're like, okay, the day before, all these Secret Service agents get drunk off their asses. They
right.
weren't in tip-top
Mhm,
shape to be
mhm,
guarding the president. They took
mhm,
the bubble, the protective bubble off the limo,
mhm,
convertible. Yeah, at
mhm,
the last minute they changed the route to
mhm,
this like 90-degree turn or whatever, where they
mhm,
were super vulnerable and going super slow, which made it,
mhm,
I don't want to say
mhm,
easy, because it was next to
mhm,
an impossible shot. And
mhm,
then the trajectory of the rounds going into Kennedy,
mhm.
it doesn't make sense.
Correct. Mhm.
And it shot also shooting Connolly in front of him,
Right.
and also, okay, the body of the president they whisked off right away against,
Mhm,
the Texas, the Dallas
mhm,
coroner. It's
mhm,
like, no, you can't. He's like, yeah, we're taking this.
mhm,
We're taking
mhm,
them.
mhm.
And there's just so many things. It's
So
like,
many,
come
an
on.
overabundance of things. That's
Yeah.
correct. Mhm. So, Patrick, that said, um, every one of those things you said struck me as odd, and there are
Yes.
a million more that you could throw into that pile where it makes you say, okay, how many coincidences before we scratch our head and go, was this planned? But beyond that, I had a very difficult time because just as you said, I always looked at the conspiracy theorists as kooks and said,
Yep.
I don't want to be one of them.
Right.
So it's the last thing you want to do. So there were so many rabbit holes that I fell into that I had to climb my way out of and say, this couldn't happen. Yeah, I mean, you got to explore every avenue. So
Right.
so I found myself going, if I'm going to present the best, the most believable story that's backed by evidence, you got to follow every lead. So I'm going in and out of these things. And at some point, I found that, and this is something that you could talk about um, with a complete evidence behind you, where forget about all the people who came later on, including myself, and have these ideas of what happened and stuff. Let's talk about what the evidence is. When the Warren Commission was put together to get to the bottom of this slash and to quell international and domestic rumors that there was a conspiracy, because that was their mandate as well, an official mandate.
Right.
But they basically, Johnson wanted this dead as soon as possible. And he told Texas, I don't want you investigating this. And he told Congress, I don't want you investigating this. It's going to be one investigatory committee, and it's going to be the Warren Commission. Chief Justice Earl Warren originally wanted no part of it. He had to be sort of like, he got dragged in kicking and screaming. So now that the Warren Commission meets, and they got some major issues. One is the Warren Commission sees the Zapruder film years before any of us saw it, and they know that his head went back and to the left, consistent with a shot from the front. So they had an issue with this. No matter how many times you say he was shot from behind, we all see in the Zapruder film his head goes back into the left.
Yes.
You're a cop. You know, if you shot Kennedy from the back, he wouldn't have reacted like that. If you shot him
Right.
from the front, he would have. So
Yes.
they could tell you all the tests they want to run, whatever. You know, from blood splatter does go every which way. I get that, but the motion of his body. So okay, so they had that and they questioned it. They weren't happy with it. The Warren Commission, members of the Warren Commission, but they also had a couple of other major issues. One being two of the bullets were fired too close together for Oswald to have loaded a bolt action rifle.
Right. It was bolt action. Yeah.
Yeah, re-aimed it and squeezed off another shot. They're like, that couldn't have happened in that quick a time. So that's an issue now that they're dealing with. So they're like, all right, now what do we do? So they go, okay, so our inspector, who's like the chief crooked guy on the Warren Commission, and there's quite a few of them, he comes up with the single bullet theory, which we've come to know as the magic bullet theory. Since you mentioned Seinfeld, we famously watched it on
Yeah.
Seinfeld, right?
Yes.
And it's hilarious, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
it is.
Kramer and they're all like figuring out how it went, and Jerry Seinfeld's going. Then it took a turn left, and the
Yeah,
spit, right?
exactly.
They
Yep.
did it with spit. So we all know that it's ridiculous. You know, the bullet supposedly entered Kennedy's neck, took a downward turn. It defies the laws of physics. Then it hit Connolly, took an upward turn, punched
Right.
the
Yeah.
lung, two ribs, hit his wrist. And there's also evidence that Kennedy was shot about 6 inches below the neckline, that it wasn't even the back of the neck. And the autopsy stuff disappeared, which is another story, the
Right.
original autopsy. So let's just go with this, what the Warren Commission is saying, before we have our own kooky conspiracy theory, right? Let's pretend we're just viewing the Warren Commission. So the Warren Commission has an issue with the space of the two shots. And in order for that to work, those two shots, they said, have to be one shot. And it's one bullet that, not two shots that hit Jack Kennedy and Governor Connolly, but one shot hit them both. So when Connolly is brought before the Warren Commission and he's presented with this single bullet theory, Connolly says, there is no way in hell, and he's a Texan who knows guns,
Right.
there's no way in hell you will ever make me believe that the same bullet that hit Kennedy hit me. I don't care how many tests you run, is what his quote is. I don't give a shit. You will never make me believe in a million years that that's what happened. He goes, I know that the president was hit and then I was hit. Two separate bullets. Governor Connolly's wife, who was next to Connolly, said the same thing. My husband was not hit by the same bullet that hit Jack. I turned around. I know when Jack was hit and I know when my husband was hit. It's two different bullets. So that said, the Warren Commission rests its entire thesis on the single bullet theory. Without it, there's two shooters in Dealey Plaza, at least.
Yeah. And
So we have at least two shooters in Dealey Plaza without it. So that falls on its head. And so the original conspiracy theorists, before me and everybody else, are members of the Warren Commission who didn't believe it, and Governor Connolly and his wife who didn't believe it. So those are your first conspiracy theorists.
yeah, they're pretty credible conspiracy theorists, that's for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
And there's the famous footage of Jackie sprawled out on the trunk of the limo, and later out we find out she's trying to get a piece of her husband's head and brain
his brain.
that were like flown back there.
Right.
And if you're shot from behind, I mean, I've been to suicides and I've been to homicides where there has been skull and brain. I know this is gross, but
No,
that's
you've
the way it
seen it. It
is.
is what it is. Yeah.
And it gets blown in that direction. It doesn't make any sense to me that his brain and his skull or pieces thereof would be in the way back part
Yeah.
of the trunk of that vehicle. And I never thought of that till recently. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Like if you're shot forward, that boom, it's gonna go
Yeah.
flying backwards, and that's
Yeah.
why Jackie was like trying to retrieve pieces of her
Yeah.
husband's brain and skull.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, too, there's a motorcycle cop off the rear left fender, Officer Hodges. and he was blasted with blood and brain tissue. And the only way for that motorcycle cop to have been blasted
Oh
with
yeah.
blood and brain tissue is if the shot came from Kennedy's right front. Um, and that's the only way to explain it. Otherwise, there's no way that gory matter,
Yeah. But then,
gory.
okay, so they arrest, Lee Harvey Oswald. He's held, at the
Mm,
jail. Then you have Jack Ruby, this guy who's a friend of the cops. He owns a strip joint and he's
mm,
mobbed up, right? He's got some
100%.
connections with, yeah.
100%. So Ruby is originally a gangster from Chicago. He's in with the Chicago mob. There's a ton of evidence for that. He also works for the Iron and Waste Handlers Union. The guy from that union was killed, and a big wig with the Chicago mob took it over. A guy by the name of Red Dorfman, and I believe that Ruby was friends with Leon Cook, the guy who was clipped before Dorfman took over that union.
Mm.
I believe Ruby was close with Cook and liked him and had a problem with Dorfman. And Dorfman had basically um, a bad vibe, fearing Ruby, knowing Ruby's a tough guy.
Yeah.
And I don't want this lunatic Ruby to just come shoot me one day. And I
Okay.
want him out of town. Yeah. So I believe he put in a beef with the Chicago mob because there's two stories. One is that Ruby was chased out of Chicago, which would be consistent with the Dorfman putting in a complaint about Ruby.
Yeah.
They'd say, "Look, Ruby, you got to go. We can't let Dorfman go. He's making millions for us.
Sure.
You're just a tough guy who's muscle. You got to go." So there's also a theory that he was redirected to Chicago to Texas by the Chicago mob. And if you're chased, that would be consistent with being redirected there, because whoever's in charge of Ruby would say, "Look, we got to get rid of you. Dorfman's got the, he's got the, bad vibe on you. He wants you out of his sight, but you're going to pick up in Texas where there's a lot of good action there, and we're going to back you." So he goes to Texas and immediately starts off right away doing stuff with the rackets. He opens up topless bars. He's putting gambling machines in different establishments, including his own. He's loaning money and he's corrupting the police right away. He's an expert at corrupting the police.
Yeah.
Some guys got a knack for that.
Sure.
They can figure out who's dirty and who's susceptible to a cash bribe and get in there. And Ruby's doing that on behalf of the mob in Texas. Now, at some point, Chicago becomes so strong in Vegas that they sort of relinquished any claim they had in Texas.
Mm.
They're like, you know what? We're making bazillions of dollars in Vegas. What do we need with Texas? Let
Yeah.
the Texas Borgata and Marcelo have that. So sort of they kind of like pull out, Chicago does, out of Texas. And Ruby is left kind of answering to Joe Civillo and Joe Campisi, who both answer to Carlos Marcello. So Ruby is sort of like part of the Marcello underworld at that point. And he's a very respected, liked part of it. They didn't think of him as, they made a thought of him as a bit of a lughead because he's a tough guy and he likes to fight people, but
Yeah.
they relied on him to corrupt the police. They relied on him for muscle if they needed it, and they liked him. He literally has a steak dinner with the Texas underboss, Joe Campisi, the night before the assassination. So he's in with the biggest guys.
Yeah.
And after he's arrested for shooting Oswald, the first guy to come up and visit him in prison is Texas underboss Joe Campisi.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, I've been in prison a long time. I spent years in prison. The underboss don't come to see you unless there's something real important that he wants to talk about
Sure.
face to face with you. In other words, it's got to be a message that he don't even trust somebody bringing to you for them to come to you directly. Usually you might get word, Peter Gotti said this, Joe Butch said that. You might get word from somebody on a visit. But for the guy himself to come see you, that's top information he's got to be sharing with you that he don't want anybody else to have. So don't forget, the underboss of the Texas Mafia visits Ruby in the county jail right after he shoots Oswald. You can't be closer to the mob than that.
Right. So do you think Ruby did what he did to shut up Oswald because he might spill the beans about all this?
100%.
Okay.
So and Hoover himself knew right away, although Hoover's public stance was it was another lone nut who shot a lone nut, his private comments were consistent with it's a mob cover up. And
Okay.
basically it's a mob cover up. So you got Oswald in a precinct and supposedly he's not talking. And we've been told that he hadn't said anything. He was clammed up. He didn't talk. But something's wrong because supposedly, and I point this out in my book, Clash of Titans, Borgata Clash of Titans, he goes into the precinct and he's interrogated for over 12 hours.
Yeah.
So historians, pro-government historians, pro-Warren Commission historians have told us for 60 years, well, there was no reason to have a stenographer there or any audio equipment because he just shrugged a lot. Okay, Pat, you're a cop. Would you interrogate me for 12 hours if I just shrugged a lot and you would just keep
No,
going for 12 hours?
it might last 15 minutes to a half an hour, maybe.
Period.
Yeah,
Right.
end
There
of
you go.
story. And for something this important, you're not telling me you're not going to have at least audio recordings of this, if not
Right.
video and audio. He just
Right.
killed the president for God, or
Exactly.
everyone. He was arrested for
Right.
killing the
President.
president.
That's
I
right.
mean, it doesn't get more important than this.
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean,
And
come
you
on.
can't tell me. And even if one guy said he shrugged a lot, aren't we still entitled to a record of the questions
Right. Right.
at the very
Absolutely. You are.
least?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Cops today can't even interrogate a lousy traffic incident without having to record it.
Oh, absolutely. Everything is recorded. That's why I get such a kick
Mhm.
out of shows, TV shows and movies where they're in an interrogation room. You've got some, I'll never forget it was like Chicago PD or Hawaii Five-0, and there's this the female detective. First of all, she's armed inside of an interrogation room. You never go armed inside an
No,
interrogation
no
room.
guns allowed, right?
No,
Yeah.
absolutely not.
Yeah. Mhm.
And she's got her gun in this guy's mouth. He's like, talk, talk. And I'm like, well, he can't talk. He's got a gun in his mouth.
Yeah.
But she would go to
Exactly.
prison. She
Yeah.
would go to prison.
For life.
No ifs,
For
ands, or
life.
buts. Yeah. I
She
mean,
did 10 years for that.
yeah, it's just craziness. It really is. But
Yeah.
yeah, it just, all right,
Yeah.
let's move on here.
Yeah.
One thing I
So
found interesting.
I just on that note, I just
Yeah.
want to say, so I watch a lot of mob movies where I'm shaking my head going, this could have never happened. I would love to have been a cop and watch cop movies.
Yeah,
You must have a ball.
I do. I
Yeah, you
do.
must have a ball.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so speaking of mob movies, The Godfather, the granddaddy of all of them. What was the blowback with the real Mafia and The Godfather?
So Joe Colombo started the Italian American Civil Rights Organization around the same time the Godfather movies are being made. And they're being made by Francis Ford Coppola, based off of Mario Puzo's novel, uh, The Godfather. So at the same time, they're filming this movie, and Joe Colombo tells them, "Hey, listen." First, he tells the press, "I don't want you using derogatory names towards Italians. No more Mafia, Cosa Nostra. I don't want to hear those names." So the press sort of obliges. Okay, no problem. And I mean, they kind of jettison free speech because Colombo technically didn't have the right to tell people what you can and can't say. It's free speech,
Right.
but press kind of goes along with it. There was only a couple of like real free speech stalwarts who said, no, that's not right, and pushed back. But for the most part, he's getting his way. So then the attorney general at the time says the same thing. I think it was Mitchell. He says, look, we won't use any derogatory names towards Italians during press conferences and what have you. We'll stop that too. So now he goes after the Godfather movie. Columbo does. And he says, I want to see the script. And if there's anything in the script I feel should be removed, I want it out. So basically, Al Ruddy, who's the producer for The Godfather, says, fine. He has Columbo in his office with a few thugs. And he goes, look, here's the script. You want to read it? Go ahead. So Columbo puts on his reading glasses and he looks down at the script and he kind of flips through a few pages and he realizes he's not really equipped to read a whole movie script. So he kind of gives it to one of his minions and says, you read it. So then the other guy starts reading it and he gets pretty much exhausts himself after 2 pages and he says, I can't read this shit. You read it. And he gives it to another guy. And eventually Columbo goes, all right, look, we're not going to read the script. Make sure all these words are out and we'll be happy. So Ruddy takes the script and tells him, I'll get rid of the words. But he forgets when I think Tom Hagen is present, Robert Duvall, is present when a movie producer says you guinea, greaseball, wop, dago, and he calls them every name in the book. Apparently, Columbo never got to that part in the script, and it was still in. Yeah, which is kind of funny, right?
Yeah, it is.
So, yeah, he puts it all in there, and that was because they didn't read the script. They should have read it. But anyway, having said that, they make a deal with Columbo, and they said, "Look, Columbo basically says we'll stop the unions that you need around this. Will stop.
Oh,
You
okay. For
won't
the
get in
production of the movie. Yeah.
production. You won't get food in and out of the place. You won't have actors. We're going to basically pull the plug. We don't have to use any muscle. We're not going to pull a gun out. We'll basically destroy this whole production overnight." And they basically admitted, Al Ruddy and a few other people connected to the production admitted later that the mob had the power. They had so much power by that point in America that they could have literally derailed the entire production overnight and stopped it from happening, let alone just delays that were costly. They could have stopped it if they wanted to. We had no choice but to oblige. And then somebody said, like, we had to deal with the spectacle because then Columbo's telling them, this is how I want you to portray us too. And somebody said it was so ironic that the mob is swearing the mafia doesn't exist and at the same time telling us how we have to portray them.
That's true. Yeah, I never
Funny,
thought of
right?
that. That is funny.
Yeah,
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 I got a kick out of that part of the book. I was like, oh, look at that.
yeah.
So let's start winding down a little bit here.
Mhm,
A few more things here,
mhm,
if I can.
mhm,
One more thing that I found interesting in the book was Jimmy Hoffa, Richard Nixon and the
mhm,
Mafia. Could you
mhm,
explain that, Stu?
mhm. Yeah. So Lyndon Johnson was as dirty as Kennedy, his vice president, and Richard Nixon was as dirty as both of them. So back then, politicians kind of knew, and that's what back to what I was talking about with Hoover. Politicians knew we need the mob, and it's like taking money today from a lobbyist. The mob had its own lobby, and basically, you want a cash-filled suitcase, you need $1 million. During the Nixon Watergate tapes, at one point he said, I think he said to, I don't know if he said it to Ehrlichman or John Dean or whoever he said it to. He said, we need $1 million cash to buy off whoever the burglars, or I know where to get it. And he was basically referring to the mob,
Yeah.
and that's Nixon saying it on the Watergate tapes. Well, so
Oh,
basically Nixon, yeah. So Nixon's just as dirty as Kennedy was. And back then, all of the politicians had something to
yeah.
do. You couldn't achieve high office without them. Carlos Marcello used to back both governors in a gubernatorial race. He would underwrite both campaigns figuring whoever wins is in my pocket.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
that's how
true.
much power they had back then.
Sure.
So, so Nixon basically gets a bribe through Chuck Colson, and he basically says, "Okay, I'm going to commute Hoffa's sentence." Hoffa eventually goes to jail for things that Bobby Kennedy started. And even though Jack Kennedy's dead now, Bobby was out as Attorney General, and Bobby is eventually murdered in 1968. Um, Hoffa still goes to prison for all of those cases that Bobby had once started. So Hoffa's in jail and he wants to get out and he wants to reclaim the Teamster Union. And basically, the new guy, Fitz, who's took over Hoffa's spot, Frank Fitzsimmons, the mob likes him too much to let go of him
Okay.
because Fitz is a jellyfish. Whereas Hoffa, if you remember, I told you Hoffa knew how to say no to the mob,
Right,
and
right,
the
right.
mob,
Yep.
yeah, the mob would get, they got 80-90% of what they wanted out of them. But if it wasn't a good deal and the pension fund was going to lose money, Hoffa would say no dice.
So
Fitz, yep, go ahead, Pat.
no, I before we like wrap this up, and I know we've been going for a while, and I
No,
appreciate your time, but we kind of glossed over Bobby Kennedy getting assassinated.
mm,
Sirhan, was arrested for it.
mm,
Uh, what happened there?
yeah,
What
wow.
happened to Sirhan, and what do you
Mm.
think? Was it just this lone? For whatever reason, he wanted to kill Kennedy, or obviously there must have been deeper roots here somewhere.
Yeah, there's more to it, and you're 100% right. Something's going on. I don't know exactly what it is. However, the coroner, Sahan supposedly fired all the shots from in front of Bobby,
Right.
uh, RFK Sr., and supposedly the Noguchi, who was the coroner, said that there was a shot that came from behind his ear at close range.
That's
So
right. Yeah.
yeah, so there's something there. There's also other people that were in the area that we haven't really identified yet. Sirhan said that he was sort of blacked out. He doesn't really remember it. He
Right.
believes he did it, but he doesn't know. So there's a possibility he was used as a sort of Manchurian candidate who we're starting to see that Crooks guy who shot at Trump in Pennsylvania may have been someone's Manchurian candidate as well. We're
Hmm.
not sure. There's something very strange with the attempted assassinations on President Trump, as well as the one on Bobby Kennedy, on RFK Sr.
Yes.
So I'm not sure where that's going to go and what we're going to see with regard to those files, but I hope we see them soon as well. There seems to be a number of inconsistencies, and we haven't been told the truth on that as well. The reason why we haven't looked at it as much as fiercely as we've looked at JFK is because JFK just overshadows Bobby so
Right.
much
It
that
does.
his
It
death
does.
is, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's like,
It will be
yeah,
very interesting to see how all that plays out too. But you know
yeah,
what? Let's finish up here. I know this is a trilogy, so we got book three coming. What
yeah.
should we look forward to in the next book?
Book three is going to be The Decline of the Mob. It's in disarray by book three. So we had Rise of Empire for book one, their golden age. Clash of Titans is when they do battle, fierce battle with the Kennedys. Also within their own ranks, there's a lot of other mob stuff in Clash of Titans. There's a civil war in the Profaci Borgata, which becomes the Colombo family. There's also a war within the Bonanno family. There's a rebellion, rather, in the Profaci family, and a civil war within the Bonanno family. There's a lot of good stuff, mafia history, where great, powerful men clash and either kill each other or figure out how they could live with each other in volume two. Volume three, they're in a spiral, it's decline. And it's sort of, look, I mean, you could argue that, America has been in some sort of decline for a few years. And the mob is sort of like, imagine it to be part of the American, uh, project, and it goes into decline at the same time. Their morals have eroded. Things have changed. There's a lot more murder. There's less of a pie they're fighting over, and they're willing to kill each other more quickly because of that.
Mm,
So that's book three.
outstanding. Looking forward to it. Do you have a title for book three yet or not?
Autumn of Empire.
Oh, very
Yeah,
good. Very good.
yeah,
Like it. All
yeah.
right. Well, let's wrap this up. Where should people go to learn more about you and your books?
I would say you could go to my website,
Yeah.
louisferrante.com, LOUISFERRANTE.com. And there's also, you could just buy the books at Barnes and Noble, any other local bookstore. If they don't have it, go straight to Amazon, and you could purchase the books at Amazon. You'll find all of my books there. First and second are already available. The third one will be by the end of the year or the beginning of next.
All right. Well, the Borgata trilogy. Looking forward to the last book. Love the first two books. You're doing great, Lou. Thank you so much for being on the show. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me once again, Patrick.